Picture yourself in a candlelit chamber, the stone walls cool to the touch, and the air faintly scented with dried lavender and smoke. Outside, a gentle rain murmurs on the thatched roof, and somewhere far off a bell tolls midnight. Tonight, our story will drift through the quiet corners of medieval life, where love was not always allowed, and yet some held hands in secret. This is not a tale of kings or grand crusades. There are no battles to follow, only the soft footsteps of forbidden affection, slow, steady, and human. Let the hush of this story carry you toward deep and restful sleep. If this gentle journey brings you comfort, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. I always love to see where in the world you listen and the hour at which you drift off. Share your peaceful place in the comments below if you wish. It began with glances, always glances, in the village of Saint-Cyr nestled in a bend of the river, where carts rattled over stones and chickens pecked freely between boots. Words were rationed more tightly than flour. People didn't waste them on things that weren't necessary. And falling in love, especially across the invisible boundary between trades, wasn't just unnecessary. It was suspicious. She sold cheese. Her name was Isabeau. She was the youngest of her daughters, known for wrapping curds in clean leaves and always tucking the softest pieces at the bottom of the basket for those who paid full price. Her stall was beside her mother's, both women up before sunrise and always first to lay this linen across the cart. The cheese was soft, mild, slightly sour when the summer was hot, and the village trusted it. Her family had sold cheese here for 2 generations. Their place in the row was permanent. He sold soap. His name was Remy. His father boiled fat in iron pots behind their cottage at the edge of the woods, where the smell of lye drifted out past the hedges and into the fields. The soaps were square, coarse, sometimes still bearing flakes of ash, but useful, honest, not something you would gift, not something that suggested tenderness. Their stall was temporary, 2 crates and a plank. They arrived late, left early. She offered him a sliver of her cheese one morning, thin and quick. He returned it the next week with a curl of rose-scented soap shaved off a larger bar. They didn't exchange names until midsummer. They didn't speak more than 2 sentences until harvest, but the space between their carts slowly narrowed. Where once there had been an aisle wide enough for a wheelbarrow, now only 2 people could pass, if one turned sideways. Isabeau's mother noticed, not in words, in glances, in sudden question asked too sharply, in a hand placed on her daughter's shoulder for just a little too long. She began sending Isabeau for change more often, but to the opposite end of the market, she repositioned their basket so it faced away from the soap. The stall remained, but it tilted, always just a few inches too far from him. Still, Remy waited. He held out her coin change with both hands now so their fingers wouldn't touch. He smiled less, looked more. They adapted. Love was cautious in Saint-Cyr. It wasn't shouted, it barely breathed. And the village, so skilled in reading silences, began to speak. The butcher's wife muttered at the well. She's still unmarried, you know, pretty but quiet, always turning down offers. Too quiet, maybe. The baker's sister rolled her eyes. He's the one with hands always stained, smells of lye. What's he doing near her cart so often? It didn't take much. In a place where everyone's habits were known and everyone's paths repeated week after week, even a pause could become proof. Even a kindness could become scandal. The first open accusation came not from an elder, but a child. Isabeau's youngest sister, barely 6, asked one morning loudly, "Why do you always look at the soap boy?" Isabeau flushed. Her mother turned. Remy, standing 5 steps away, froze with his crate still half unpacked. No one laughed. That afternoon their stalls were moved apart. Not far, just 1 space down, but it was enough. The man who sold nails and spare hinges took the gap, loud, broad, oblivious. His presence was a wall, but hearts don't stop with distance. Isabeau still found ways to pass him, a longer route to the baker, a new excuse to fetch water from the far barrel. Sometimes she didn't speak, sometimes she didn't even look up, but her steps slowed when she walked past, and he noticed, always. One morning, Remy placed a bar of soap on her cart when no one was looking. She found it hours later, small, square, lavender-scented, carved with the letter I. She hid it in her apron. Her hands shook when she served the next customer. That evening she placed a wrapped cheese sliver beneath his plank, folded into the cloth like a coin. But cloth can't hide forever. It was a bad season for secrets. A storm that had rolled in from the west soaked half the market the following week. Carts shifted, stalls collapsed, a goat went missing, and as people yelled and scrambled, someone saw Isabeau press her hand into Remy's. Quick, steady, unmistakable. No transaction, no explanation, just fingers curled together like they were used to it. By nightfall, the whispers had become declarations. She touched him. Not even at her stall. And she smiled. The next day, she arrived at the market alone. Her mother stayed behind. Remy didn't come at all. But people still talked. And what was once glances and crumbs and hidden tokens had become something heavier, something the village could point to, wrinkle its nose at, and call improper. The stall where Remy once stood remained empty for 3 weeks. Isabeau's baskets looked smaller. Her prices dropped, but her eyes never did. She still glanced down the aisle, just once before packing up, until one Thursday near dusk, Remy returned. He stood beside her cart as the sun dipped low, said nothing, bought no cheese, just looked, and she looked back, and everyone saw. Which leads us here to the breathless edge of the story. In a village where holding hands was louder than any shout, what happens when two people finally stop fighting? They didn't speak, not aloud, not where others could hear. But that Thursday evening, as the sky turned grey and the last of the crows wheeled overhead, Remy and Isabeau stood close enough that the air between them felt like its own language. It said, "We are still here." It said, "They've seen us now, so what happens next?" Saint-Cyr did not forgive what it noticed. The baker's wife crossed herself and turned her back. The carpenter, whose son had once tried to court Isabeau and been gently refused, spat near the soap plank. Not at it, just near enough. People bought quickly, avoided eye contact and left. By the following week, the message had changed from silence to structure. A quiet warning had been sent to Remy's father. If the boy was seen loitering near the dairy stalls again, their license to sell in the Thursday market might not be renewed. There were rules, after all, not written, but deeply understood. Unspoken boundaries between families, between trades, between expectations. And crossing them, especially for love, was a dangerous kind of arrogance. Isabeau's mother took action in her own way. Her daughter was now forbidden from standing at the stall without supervision. She worked behind the cart, not beside it. Her hands wrapped cheese in silence. Her feet never left the shade of the linen canopy. She was watched, and Remy for a time obeyed. He returned to the edge of the market, where soap sellers belonged. No glances, no tokens. He packed quickly, sold quietly, and kept his head down. But the thing about love, especially love that has been seen, is that it can't go backward, because now the village knew, and knowing gave the people something to guard against. The priest mentioned modesty in his sermon, twice in the same homily. An older woman near the fountain shook her head and murmured about young ones forgetting their place. And a new girl, young and unmarried, was offered the vacant stall beside the cheese cart, not because she sold anything useful, but because she was known to be obedient. The stall wasn't about sales, it was about separation. But hearts don't file petitions, and feelings don't schedule themselves around punishments. One morning, quiet, rainy, half the stalls missing, Remy walked directly to the cheese cart. He didn't touch Isabeau, he didn't speak. He placed a folded piece of cloth on the edge of her stall and left. Inside was a bar of soap carved with 2 birds, one wing slightly crooked. She wrapped it again and kept it under her skirt until she went home. That night her mother found it, said nothing. But the next morning Isabeau did not come to market. The day after that her absence continued, and the third day Remy was called to the magistrate's office. Not a courtroom, not an arrest, just summons. He was told the soap licence would not be renewed for autumn unless his conduct improved, that the village had noticed, that families were concerned, that a girl's name could be ruined for less. He nodded, once, left, and returned to the stall the very next Thursday. But this time he didn't stay at his post, he didn't carve birds, he didn't leave offerings. He simply waited until Isabeau reappeared, eyes lowered, arm looped through her mother's, carrying a basket of wrapped cheese with hands that trembled only slightly. And when she walked past him, he fell in step beside her. Just 2 paces, just long enough for one person to notice. And one did. A boy, barefoot, young enough to speak without caution. He pointed. They're walking together. The words echoed louder than a shout. By sunset, the decision had been made. The two would be brought before the village council, not for sin, not for law-breaking, but for disturbance, for distracting others, for undermining trade, for refusing to stay in their places. The punishment was chosen the old way, simple, public. They would stand in the square, side by side, and be named. Named as a warning, not for what they had done, but for what they might have done if no one had spoken up. So on a cold morning 1 week later they stood, Isabeau in a plain wool cloak, Remy in his work tunic, sleeves still dusted with soap ash. They said nothing, they were told not to. The priest read a passage about shame, the aldermen announced their names. The villagers gathered, some out of curiosity, some with stones in their pockets they would not throw. And then, the silence. The punishment wasn't stocks, it wasn't lashing, it was just to stand for an hour while others stared. But sometimes silence wounds more deeply than rope. They stood, faces toward the church wall, hands at their sides, until Remy reached slightly to his right. And Isabeau, after a pause, let her hand brush his. They didn't hold tightly, they didn't turn, but the village saw. 2 hands resting near one another, just enough to touch. And no one moved. No one dared say it, but they all saw it. They were being shamed, and they still reached for each other. Which leads to a final question for this part of the story. If punishment could not sever the quiet between them, what would the village do next? The hour passed slowly. The sun never quite broke through the clouds, and the wind carried the smell of damp hay and burnt fat from a distant fire. Remy and Isabeau stood still against the church wall just as they'd been told. Their hands did not remain linked, not fully, but they stayed close, brushed now and then, reminded each other. Enough that even those who tried to avert their eyes could not help but notice. There was no apology in their posture, no rebellion either, just presence, just 2 people who had chosen to stand quietly together, even when every rule around them had asked them not to. After the hour ended, the priest gave no blessing. The alderman gave no gesture of release, but a bell chimed once from the tower. It was not for them, but it marked the moment. The 2 stepped away, not quickly, not triumphantly, just carefully, with dignity. The villagers did not jeer, not openly. That had already been done. What followed was worse, distance. They looked away when Remy passed. They spoke to Isabeau's mother and not to her. They offered no greetings, no warm handshakes at the stalls, no small barters of respect. The punishment had not ended with the bell, it had only changed shape. The cheese stall remained, but fewer buyers came. Some mumbled about milk gone sour. Others mentioned unseen hands. The soap cart, once tolerated, now stood on the far edge of the square beside the chicken pens and broken crates. People still needed soap, but they didn't thank him when they bought it. And yet, every Thursday both came. Every Thursday they arrived. They stood on opposite ends of the market, tended their wares, said little, and waited. Once, just once, Isabeau left a heel of soft cheese near the well, wrapped in cloth. No mark, no message. Remy found it later, tucked beside his jug. He didn't look around. He just unwrapped it, smelled the rind, and ate it slowly. Time moved in weeks, then months. The village, like all villages, tired of its own scandal. New things happened. An ox went missing. A roof collapsed. A child fell into the stream and survived. Life resumed its muddy pace. The council no longer mentioned the couple. The priest eventually spoke again about sin, but only in broad terms. One winter morning Remy stopped appearing. For 3 weeks his soap cart remained empty. The crates stacked and abandoned. Some said he'd gone north. Others said he'd joined a mason's crew in the next town. A few muttered that he'd left quietly after one too many weeks of silence from the market. Isabeau continued to come. Her mother spoke again, now and then. The stall regained a few customers. The prices returned to normal. But Isabeau's face changed. She smiled less. She watched the path beyond the church more than she watched the buyers. Then early in spring, Remy returned. Not with a cart, not with soap, just with travel on his boots and something different in his shoulders. He didn't come to the stall, he didn't speak to the council. He came to the well, drew water, and sat in the sun. And that afternoon, as the market began to close, Isabeau walked to the edge of the square, past the stalls, past the gossip, past the unspoken rules, and sat beside him. They spoke for the first time in months, only for a few minutes, but they didn't look over their shoulders. They didn't whisper, they just sat, and then rose, and walked through the village together, one step behind the other, no longer pretending not to be seen. They didn't marry, not right away, There were still objections, still mothers and magistrates who remembered the shame, but neither disappeared, and though they were never fully embraced, they were no longer forbidden. They lived quietly, their homes were modest, their names stayed on the church rolls, uncelebrated but present, and through it all they never once apologised. Not for the glances, not for the soap, not for the hand that brushed another, even when every rule told them not to reach. The scriptorium was always quiet. Stone walls, muffled sound, and the soft scratch of quills was the loudest noise anyone dared make. In the convent of St. Leoba, tucked in a wooded valley where the river bent sharply west, the nuns copied psalms, letters, and saints' lives by daylight and prayer. Their hands were steady, their thoughts God-bound, or so it was supposed to be, but Sister Agnes was different. Not careless, not rebellious, just attentive. She noticed details in the texts others skimmed over. She copied marginalia with a flourish not required, and she asked questions, quietly but often. When the abbot sent his scribes to train the nuns in finer script, she paid closer attention than any of her sisters, especially to the scribe named Martin. He wasn't a priest, just a lay brother, skilled in ink and Latin. He came twice a week, walking the wooded road from the nearby monastery. He never stayed more than an hour past dusk, never entered without permission. But when he spoke, his voice carried something careful in it, something softer than the chants they practiced at morning prayer, and Sister Agnes found herself listening more than necessary. At first they exchanged nothing more than pages. She passed him parchment to review. He returned it with a note pinned to the margin. Excellent hand. Then another week. Mind the curve of your G. Nothing improper, nothing personal. Until one day, beside a line from the Canticles, he wrote simply, "You copied this verse beautifully." That verse, of course, was the one that read, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth." Agnes said nothing. She made no reply, but the next time she copied that line, her letters were smaller, straighter, more deliberate. He noticed, and so it began. Their exchange remained buried in the margins. Tiny notes, disguised as corrections. A faint asterisk meant, "I saw your change." A flourish on a period meant, "Thank you for your care." They never spoke about it. They never touched. But week by week, their conversation deepened, not in words but in ink. The candles in the scriptorium burned longer now. Agnes stayed after the other sisters left, pretending to regrind her pigments. Martin delayed his departure, always with a scroll in hand, always with a reason. Sometimes they stood on opposite ends of the same table. Neither looked up. Then one evening the abbess entered early. The silence had grown too thick, the ink too quiet. She watched as Martin passed a parchment to Agnes. A verse, handwritten, not copied. It read, "Love is strong as death, jealousy as cruel as the grave." It was from the Song of Songs, forbidden to be quoted freely, and certainly not passed from a man to a cloistered nun. That parchment was taken. He was sent away. She was not scolded, yet, but her quill was taken for a week, her candle ration halved. She was sent to garden duty. The sisters said nothing, but the silence around her shifted, not hatred, not pity, just space, because the convent, like any small world, knew what closeness looked like, even when hidden in Latin. And now the unspoken question lingered, like smoke in the rafters. What does one do with a love that lives only in margins? The parchment was locked away, folded 3 times, tied with ribbon, and placed in the abbess's cabinet with the other warnings and regrets of convent history. It wasn't the first time love had crept between the walls of St. Leoba, but it was the first time it had arrived so neatly lettered in a man's hand. That made it harder to dismiss, harder to forgive. Ink had permanence. It could not be denied. Sister Agnes no longer sat in the scriptorium. She took her meals in silence, washed laundry alone behind the chapel, and wasn't called to read aloud during the morning recitation. No one said why. No one had to. The absence of her quill said everything. Her fingers, once blackened with soot and gall, now wrinkled under cold water and soap. Her quiet pride, once drawn from clean lines and shaped letters, now lingered only in memory. But memory, like ink, stained slowly. And Martin? He had vanished. Not formally exiled, but not seen again either. His visits ended without explanation. His footsteps no longer echoed down the cloister. The parchment samples he had left behind were gathered and burned in a small iron pot. One sister whispered that she'd seen his face at the edge of the woods days later, near the path that led to the monastery. But no one confirmed it, and no one brought his name into the refectory again. Agnes asked no questions, not aloud, but her gaze searched every folded letter, every message passed between convent and town for signs of his script. She knew his hand better than her own. She could recognise the tilt of his E, the peculiar way he left too much space after a comma. But no letters bore those marks now. He was gone, or silenced, and she remained. When her quill was returned weeks later, the silence in the scriptorium greeted her like a room, still holding its breath. She dipped the nib slowly, let the ink cling, wrote deliberately, not sacred verses this time, but inventory. A list of sheep hides for parchment, pigment levels, quill shortages, dry words, safe words, words that couldn't be read any other way, but still she wrote with care, as if he might somehow see it, as if the act of writing even plainly might send something to him. And then, a month after her return to the desk, a scroll arrived. It was official, boring, a ledger for ink procurement, but tucked into the back, almost missed, was a spare sheet folded twice. She opened it with shaking hands. The writing inside was in her own hand, a copy, a perfect mirror of the verse Martin had once given her, only this time it had been returned. On the bottom, a single line added in smaller script. Even if no one reads us again, I still remember. There was no signature, no name, but she knew. The abbess must have allowed it through, or overlooked it. Perhaps even pitied them. Perhaps not. Agnes would never ask. But she copied the scroll carefully, passed it along, and tucked the extra sheet into the folds of her psalter. She never wrote him again. Not with ink. Not with parchment. But every time she copied scripture, she left him something, sometimes a slightly exaggerated capital letter, shaped like his initials, sometimes a line with gentler spacing, sometimes just an extra curl on a period. Nothing improper, nothing anyone else would see, but she saw, and she imagined, on the other side of the woods, in another scriptorium, that someone still remembered how she curved her S, that he still turned the page and paused once in a while as if expecting a margin note. Because even without words, even without hands, love had lived in their letters. And letters, once formed, are hard to erase. Years passed. The convent of St. Lioba changed slowly, as all such places do. A new abbess took the veil. The roof above the scriptorium was repaired after a long winter of leaks. The rushes in the hallway were replaced with gravel. The beeswax candles burned brighter, but the evening still felt dim, and Sister Agnes, no longer quite young, remained at her desk, her quill as steady as ever. Her script was praised often, her ink preparation admired. Her fingers, once pale, had taken on a permanent grey tinge that no amount of washing could lift. She smiled rarely. She was left alone. No one spoke of Martin anymore. The young sisters didn't know the story. The older ones remembered, but had long since chosen to forget, or pretend to. The convent was quieter without scandal, and no one liked to reopen the pages of what had already been bound shut. But sometimes, at dusk, when Agnes remained behind as the others lit the chapel lamps, she would pause over her work. Her fingers would stop just before forming a line, and she would trace an invisible letter in the air, an old habit, a gesture toward a name never spoken aloud. The psalter where she had hidden the verse still sat on her shelf, wrapped now in linen to protect the cover. She had not looked at the page in years, but she had never moved it. It was part of her now, as fixed as the scar on her wrist from a candle burn, or the crease beside her eye from decades of squinting at fine lines. One day a monk arrived from the neighbouring monastery with a request, a recopying of the Rule of St. Benedict in Agnes's hand. A sign of respect she accepted quietly. The scroll he handed her included instructions, ink measurements, deadlines, and tucked between the layers was something folded in two. A page, blank, except for one line at the bottom. The shape of your words changed the shape of my life. There was no signature, no clue, just the line. But the script, though more aged, more cramped, was unmistakable. She touched the page only once, then folded it again, then placed it beside the psalter. That night, she did not sleep. She lit a candle, sat at her desk, and for the first time in many years, wrote a letter that would never be sent. It said nothing improper, nothing bold, only quiet things. the way the light fell across her inkstone, the way her hand remembered how to curve certain words without the thinking, the way the scriptorium still smelled of old vellum and iron. She folded the letter, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it between two unused folios on her shelf, not to be found, not to be read, just to exist, because theirs had been a love of restraint, a love without flesh, a love made only of breath and ink and time, and yet it had shaped them both. She never left the convent. He, she assumed, never returned to hers, but on the days when her hand trembled, or when her eyes blurred with age, she still remembered how it felt to know someone, somewhere. Once read her letters as if they mattered more than prayer, and in the quietest way possible, she knew he still did. The river ran slower near the mill, broad and brown, always carrying the scent of wet wood and flour. The wheel creaked rhythmically, a sound so constant the villagers stopped hearing it, but she heard it every time. From the stone walkway atop the south wall of her father's manor, she could watch it turn. It became part of her afternoons, just like the call of the swans, or the scolding voice of her nurse, or the distant thump of bread being kneaded in the kitchen yard. Her name was Eleanor. She was 16. Her father, Lord Geoffroy, owned the land surrounding 3 villages, 6 fields, and the mill itself. The structure belonged to him, but the work belonged to someone else, someone whose name, by all rules of rank, she should not have known. His name was Etienne. He was the miller's boy, 4 years older, with hair bleached lighter than the oat sacks he hauled each day. His arms were knotted with effort, but his voice was quiet. He didn't look up when nobles passed. He didn't speak to servants unless spoken to. He kept to the shadows of the turning wheel, to the smell of grain, to the rhythm of labour. But once, when Eleanor dropped her leather glove from the bridge overlooking the path, he picked it up. He didn't speak, just held it up to her. And she, from the height of the stone railing, thanked him in a voice quieter than she'd ever used before. After that, things changed. She found excuses to walk past the mill on her way to chapel. Etienne found reasons to linger outside when she did. They said nothing, at first, but silence turned to greetings, greetings to questions, questions to answers. Then came a day when she asked him about his mother. Gone. He asked her about the books in her father's study. She lied and said she was allowed to read them. He lied and said he had learned to write. The gap between their worlds narrowed with every sentence. They never touched. Not then, but the space between them had changed, and people noticed. The house steward mentioned Eleanor's walks were growing long. Her nurse asked pointed questions about her mud-streaked hem. The guards at the gate began to walk more slowly when she passed by, so she adjusted, left earlier, walked faster, spoke less, and still she found him. One morning, beside the mill wall where water pooled in the worn grooves, they stood too close. It was chilly. Her hands were bare. He looked at her and said, without ceremony, "You shouldn't be here." She said, "I know." Neither moved. He reached for her wrist, not with urgency, but with something like awe. She didn't pull away. They kissed once. It was brief, a breath. And then the baker's son passed by, rounding the bend too early on his flour delivery. He saw. He said nothing to them, but his silence didn't protect them. By the next morning, the manor's guard was waiting at the base of the bridge. Etienne was gone. Eleanor was confined to her chamber, and all the doors that had opened so easily before were now locked. The glove she'd once dropped remained in Etienne's hands, but she never saw it again. What she saw instead was the river, wider than before, colder, and rushing much too fast to ever explain what had happened. They never asked her if it had happened. They simply acted as though it had. The morning after Etienne disappeared, the manor felt different, stiff, watchful, and wordless. Her nurse would not meet her eyes. The steward kept his answers short, and when her father passed her in the corridor, he said nothing at all. But his silence was not absence. It was weight. It hung behind her, followed her up the stairs, and filled her chamber like smoke. There was no mention of where Etienne had gone, no confirmation that he had been dismissed, no accusation spoken aloud, but the kitchen girls whispered so when they thought she wasn't listening. That he had been seen riding east, that the stable hand had given him a satchel, that he had taken nothing from the mill, not even his coat. And Eleanor said nothing. She sat by the window, staring at the path that once led to the mill. She counted how many mornings had passed. She rehearsed what she might have said if anyone had asked, but they didn't. They didn't need to. A kiss, even whispered about, was enough. It wasn't the passion that frightened them. It was the pattern. A lord's daughter and a boy with no land. It wasn't love that was dangerous. It was disobedience. Love didn't break rules. But crossing a line without permission, that did. That made people anxious. And when people grew anxious, they punished what they didn't fully understand. So the punishment came in silence. Eleanor was no longer sent to chapel, no longer invited to sit in the manor garden. Her books were removed, her lessons stopped. She was not struck or locked or made to weep, not outwardly, but she was erased from the house in pieces, spoken of in third person, kept inside, told when to eat and when to sleep and when not to look out the window. And Etienne? She only knew what others hinted. One said he had gone to Rouen to apprentice with a builder. Another claimed he had joined a caravan heading toward the sea. The steward muttered that he had been offered a better match elsewhere, which sounded more like a lie meant to quiet guilt than a plan. And still, no one asked her how she felt. No one asked if she had loved him, because love was not part of the language of nobles. Love was not listed in the dowry or the inheritance ledger. Love was not carved into the manor beams, but something in her had shifted. She no longer asked for news. She no longer paced the halls. She no longer waited at the window. Instead, she began to sew. Quietly, constantly, the same stitch over and over. Not to forget, but to stay steady. To hold on to something small, precise, and hers. And one evening, as she stitched beneath the candlelight, the maid assigned to her room spoke without looking up. "There's a letter." Eleanor's fingers stopped. The maid didn't meet her gaze, only set a folded scrap of parchment beside the basin, then left. It was not signed. The script was rough, unpracticed, slanted, but the words were steady. "I crossed the river, not because I was told, but because I had to. I remember your hand, that's all I've carried." Nothing more, no date, no promise, no plan, but that was enough. She didn't weep. She didn't smile. She folded the letter and stitched it into the hem of her shift, just above the knee where no one would find it, where it would stay warm with her body, where it would walk with her wherever she was sent, because she would be sent. That was clear now. She wouldn't remain in this house. Not forever. Not after this. But if the world insisted on keeping them apart, what would it do with a love too quiet to punish and too steady to erase? The letter remained in the hem of her shift, even after the garment grew too tight and had to be let out by a tailor. Even when it was moved from shift to petticoat, and from petticoat to travel cloak, Eleanor kept it with her, not as proof of rebellion, but as a kind of compass. A northward point her thoughts could turn toward in silence. Life continued, as it always did in noble houses. Walls were repaired, fields were ploughed, suitors were invited. The first arrived in late spring. He was a cousin to a viscount, with calves shaped from riding and teeth that showed when he smiled. Eleanor was polite. She answered his questions. She poured his wine. But her eyes wandered beyond the room, toward the window, toward the road that led past the mill, now repaired, now tended by another boy whose name she never asked. The suitor spoke often, but he never noticed that her hands didn't fidget, or that she never once reached for the wine herself. She did not refuse him, that wasn't allowed, but she didn't encourage him either, and after 3 visits, he stopped coming. The second suitor stayed longer. He came with gifts, lace, a prayer book, a brooch shaped like a lily. Eleanor accepted them, thanked him, and placed them in her chest beneath her linen. She never wore them, she never told her maid what they meant, and eventually her silence sent him away too. Whispers resumed. "She's stubborn," one said. "She thinks herself above them all," muttered another. But no one remembered Etienne's name anymore. No one dared suggest that it was a mill boy who had taught her how to endure silence without shame. Years passed. Her father's health faded. The land passed to a cousin. Eleanor was sent to live with her mother's sister in a smaller manor near the coast, far from Saint-Cyr, far from the turning wheel, far from the place where her name had once sat on everyone's tongue. The new house was colder, the sea air harsher, but she had a window, and she had her letters, even if there was only one. She became known as a quiet presence in the household, gentle, observant, always willing to help with the linen, the accounts, the binding of candles. She learned how to cure lavender. how to store fish against salt, how to read faces without asking questions, but she never married. The suitors stopped arriving after a time. People assumed it was her temperament, or her upbringing, or her stubbornness. They didn't guess it was because she had already chosen once, and that was enough. No one knew that the cloak she wore each winter still carried a folded scrap of parchment, stitched neatly into the lining. The ink had faded, the corners had softened, but the message remained. I crossed the river. I remember your hand. One winter she did visit Saint-Cyr again, briefly, for a cousin's christening. The manor had changed. The guards were new, the mill was still there, but rebuilt, smaller, tucked further back into the reeds. She did not go near it, but she stood on the bridge once more, her cloak drawn tight against the wind. She looked at the water, then back at the fields, and for a moment she thought she saw someone walking the path from the edge of the trees. He didn't wave, she didn't call out, and the moment passed. Perhaps it was no one, perhaps it was someone else, but still, her heart paused, just long enough to remind her that what they had shared wasn't entirely gone. It had not broken history. It had not changed the course of the land, but it had shaped her, in silence, in patience, in the way she stitched a letter into her life and refused to let it fade. Her name was Marjorie. She had married at 17, as most girls in the village of Low Elm did. Her husband, Thomas, was a cooper, a barrel maker with steady hands and quiet eyes. He worked long hours and came home with the smell of smoke and pitch still clinging to his sleeves. They had no children. Not for lack of trying, people whispered. But the years had passed quietly, with no small feet on their floorboards and no toys left beside the hearth. Marjorie sold wool on Thursdays. She gathered it from her cousin's sheep, washed it in the stream, laid it out to dry in their small yard, and rolled it tightly into bundles tied with thin twine. It gave her something to do, something to speak about when women gathered near the well. It gave her a reason to visit the pasture twice a week. And that's where she met him. His name was Adam. He was not from Low Elm. He came from the hills beyond the edge of the forest. People said he slept outside more often than not, even when it rained, that he knew how to whistle birds to him, that he had a scar just under his collarbone shaped like a crescent. None of those things mattered to Marjorie at first. He was just the boy with the crooked smile who always nodded politely when she passed the fence. But once, after a storm, one of the lambs had gone missing. Marjorie offered to help. She climbed over the fence in her shoes and stockings and followed the trail of mud to the base of the hill. She found the lamb curled beneath a fallen branch. She called for Adam, and he came running. They brought the animal back together, and when they reached the fence again, both soaked and covered in grass and bits of thorn, he took her hand. Not firmly, not eagerly, just long enough to steady her as she stepped down. She laughed then, a real laugh. Not the kind meant for neighbours or meal blessings, the kind that came when you forgot, for a moment, who you were supposed to be. And Adam kissed her. Quick, unguarded, on the cheek, just near her ear. She pulled away. He apologised. She said nothing. She left. But that was not the end, because a shepherd's field is never empty. There are eyes, even when you don't see them. That same evening, the baker's wife mentioned a strange story she had overheard from her niece, whose cousin worked for a farmer who kept sheep 2 plots down. By Friday, Marjorie's name was being spoken in tones too low for decency and too loud for denial. No one asked if it was true. They didn't need to. A woman, married and childless, with a habit of walking alone? She had always been suspect. The church warden spoke to her husband. Thomas said little. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike her. He simply asked her, once, whether the shepherd had touched her hand. She said yes. And so it began. She wasn't sent away. No one thought she had committed a sin worth exile, but she had broken trust, and in Low Elm trust was everything. She was made to confess, not to God but to the village. They held no trial, only a gathering, near the stocks, a small crowd, quiet. The alderman spoke. He said, "Marriage is not a prison, but it is a promise." He said, "A moment of folly must be met with an hour of reckoning." And so Marjorie was placed in the stocks, not for adultery, not for treason, just for the kiss, for letting another man see something that should have remained within her walls. Her hands were bound gently, the stocks were not locked tight, but she was there nonetheless, for half a day. Her husband did not visit. Adam was nowhere to be found. And yet, when the bell rang at dusk and the last woman left the market, someone placed a folded cloth beside her foot. Inside it, a single stalk of lavender and a small white pebble smoothed by the river. She said nothing when she was released. She took the cloth, kept the pebble, and walked home with the same silence she had always worn, but now it carried a question. What happens when your heart remembers something the village insists you forget? Marjorie's feet ached for days after the stocks. Not from the binding, it had not been cruel, but from the stillness, from the long hours of being seen and not spoken to, from the weight of dozens of eyes pretending not to look while others stared too long. The bruises would fade, but the stillness of body, of breath, of place would settle into her joints like rain settles into the grain of old wood. Quiet, permanent. When she returned to the cottage, the door was not barred. Her husband was at the table. He did not rise. She did not speak. He poured water into a shallow bowl and left it on the hearth. Then he returned to his carving, a set of pegs for barrels, shaped neatly one after another. The lavender stalk she'd been given she pressed into a book of saints' days and slipped into the corner of a chest. The pebble she placed near the window where it caught the morning light. Small things, quiet symbols. She made no claims about them, but neither did she hide them. Thomas did not ask, and she did not offer. But the space between them thickened. The village, meanwhile, returned to rhythm, as it always did. Bread was baked, goats were milked, the well creaked at morning and again at dusk. People no longer whispered about Marjorie, but they did not greet her either. They bought wool without comment, they passed her on the path without nods. The silence had evolved into something cooler than shame, something that pretended not to remember, while ensuring she never forgot. She stopped going to market. Instead, she left bundles of wool with her cousin, who sold them under another name. She stayed close to home, dug new garden beds, re-stitched old cloaks, scrubbed the hearth with more force than was needed. The days became full, not because they were busy, but because they were heavy. And yet, the lavender bloomed again. Spring brought warm winds and soft rains, and the hills beyond the forest turned green in the early light. She did not look for him, but she remembered. Not just the kiss, the voice, the steadiness in it, the way he had once handed her the lamb, not boastfully, but carefully, like it mattered who took it. One morning she found a scrap of wool on the fence post, dyed red, frayed at the edge, knotted twice. She said nothing, but she untied it, took it inside, folded it neatly, and waited. She never saw Adam again, not clearly. But now and then, in the late dusk, a figure passed the far edge of the field where the tree line began. He never approached, never lingered, but always turned just enough that she could know he had not forgotten. Her husband, Thomas, continued to build, quietly, cleanly. His barrels were praised, his name kept. They remained married. She did her duties. But the silence between them now had two layers, the one they showed others and the one they shared. Because a kiss, even one not pursued, becomes a thread. Tied once, never quite undone, and Marjorie now carried that thread the way one carries a line of mending through cloth, hidden on the underside but always shaping the fabric above, which leads to one final question for this part of the hill. When a moment is survived, but never forgiven, does it stay with you like guilt or like memory? The years passed without drama. That in itself became a kind of mercy. No second scandal arrived to replace the first. No new suitor, no visible rebellion. Marjorie grew into middle age with hands always busy and a face that never changed much, except in the way it no longer looked up when people passed. She remained in Low Elm, in the same cottage, with the same routines, the same husband. The scandal softened, but never vanished. It folded itself into the corners of the village like soot, never visible but never gone. Thomas never spoke of it again. Not the kiss, not the stocks, not the lavender or the silence that followed. Their marriage continued, measured not in affection but in habit. He worked, she worked, they ate together, slept beside one another. But the closeness had become practical, not personal. The home was stable yet hollow, like a barrel, well built, watertight, but filled with air. Marjorie never expected forgiveness. She didn't ask for it. What she wanted, if anything, was simply to exist without the weight of explanation. But she carried it anyway, quietly. A small invisible bag strapped across her chest, full of what-ifs, of glances remembered, of silences that once meant something more than punishment. The lavender, dried and flattened, stayed inside the book. The pebble gathered dust by the window. She never moved it, never cleaned it. Once a child asked why there was a stone indoors. She said it was to hold down the edge of the curtain. That was all. Adam never returned to the village openly, but stories drifted in from the hills that a shepherd fitting his description had been seen near the forest line, that a flock sometimes grazed closer than usual to Low Elm's outer fields. Marjorie said nothing. But every time she walked the edge of the property to check the fence or scatter feed, she walked just a little slower near the tree line. Her hair turned grey, her hands grew thinner, but her back stayed straight. She became the woman others came to when they needed quiet help, binding a sprained ankle, finding the softest place in a cloak's seam, counting coins when numbers faltered. She spoke little, but she listened, and in that listening the village, without ever saying so, let her back in, not as one of their own, but as someone useful, reliable, still here, and that too was a kind of peace. Years later, after Thomas died of a chill that never left him, Marjorie buried him with care. She washed his clothes, stitched his shroud, and sat by the fire in silence for 3 days. She cried once, briefly, not out of grief exactly, but from the weight of endings. He had never been cruel, only distant, and in a way she had lived 2 lives during their marriage, one above the floorboards, dutiful, visible, upright, and one beneath, carried quietly in a stitched hem, in a dried flower, in the memory of a hand that steadied her as she climbed down from a fence. She lived many years more, never remarried, tended the garden, lit the fire, mended the hems of the neighbours' children, and every so often she would look toward the edge of the woods, not expecting, not hoping, but remembering. Because some loves do not ask to be fulfilled, they ask only to be remembered, honestly, without shame, without denial, and sometimes that's enough. They were just 2 boys, or so everyone said at first, apprentices, sweating under woolen tunics, sharing tools and silence in the back corner of a carpenter's yard in the town of Saint-Perrin. One was named Luc, the other Mathieu. Luc had come from the north, thin-faced and red-knuckled, always squinting. Mathieu had been born 3 lanes down from the workshop and arrived each morning with sawdust or ED clinging to his boots. They slept in the same loft, above the tools, beneath the roof where the beams groaned in winter. It was normal, expected. Apprentices shared beds. Masters did not pay for space they couldn't use. The straw mattress was narrow, their elbows often knocked. But it was nothing strange, at least not at first. They rose at dawn, took turns sweeping the sawdust, fetched water, sanded boards, and spoke little in front of others. But in the quiet hours of twilight, when the rest of the shop had emptied, they sometimes lingered, talking in half-whisper. Tours, sharing crusts, laughing softly, nothing more, or so they told themselves, but Luc began to linger a little longer by Mathieu's side as they packed the tools. Mathieu's hand paused too long when brushing sawdust from Luc's shoulder. There were no declarations, no stolen kisses behind the workshop, just presence, familiarity that held warmth even in silence. One night, after a feast day, the master drank more than usual and forgot to bolt the workshop door. The boys lay awake, watching the moonlight creep across the floorboards. Luc shifted. Mathieu whispered something, a joke, a story, something lost now to time. Luc laughed, loudly, too loudly. And someone heard. The neighbour's boy, old enough to know trouble when he saw it, reported that the apprentices shared more than just straw. He said they had spoken strange and laughed like girls. He said he had seen Luc touch Mathieu's back in the dark. The accusation travelled fast, faster than either boy could react. The master, red-faced with shame or rage, perhaps both, dragged them from the loft the next morning and set them before the town bailiff. Not in shackles, not yet, but surrounded by muttering townspeople, and a silence that thickened as soon as the charges were spoken aloud. They were not accused of a crime at first, only of impropriety, of being too close, of disrupting the dignity of the workshop, but the murmurs grew heavier. The priest spoke of sodomite tendencies. A mother near the baker's stall crossed herself and turned away. No one cared that nothing had been seen, that no sin had been proven, that their only real crime, if one could call it that, was comfort in one another's presence. They were separated immediately. Luc was dismissed from the workshop and sent to labour on a road crew 2 towns over. Mathieu was kept on but watched. The loft was emptied. The mattress burned. And when Mathieu was asked whether Luc had touched him with unnatural intent, he could not answer. Not out of guilt, but out of grief. Because what he had shared with Luke had no name, no language in the catechism, no place in the confession box. It was simply a closeness that made the workday bearable. That turned silence into safety. But now even that silence had been taken from them. Which leads to the heavy question this story carries. When the world insists on defining love only by fear, what happens to the kind that asks for nothing but to exist? The loft felt hollow after Luke left. Not just empty, hollow. The kind of absence that hangs in the air, in the wood grain, in the folds of a blanket that no longer needs folding. Mathieu still climbed the narrow ladder each night, though no one expected him to anymore. The straw had been replaced, but the shape of their shared sleep lingered, pressed invisibly into the boards. Even the dust motes seemed quieter. The workshop tried to forget quickly. The master, eager to prove discipline, demanded longer hours and stricter silence. The other apprentices avoided Mathieu not out of the cruelty, but from the fear that speaking to him might mark them too. Even kindness had become suspect. Mathieu did as he was told. He spoke only when asked. He carried boards twice his weight. He ate alone. But inside something buckled. Not because he had been accused, not because people stared, but because Luke was gone, and no one had asked him how that felt. No one cared how that felt. They had shared everything, not just space and scraps of bread, but the soft things, the glances, the kind of laugh that escapes before you realise how loud it is, the warmth of breathing near someone in the dark when the wind outside howled and the roof creaked in its sleep. Now that warmth had been turned against them, called unclean, redefined without their consent. A week after Luke was sent away, a formal inquiry began. Not a trial, not yet, but questions. The parish clerk interviewed witnesses. Mathieu was asked again and again if anything shameful had happened. He said no, truthfully, because what they shared had never been shameful to him. Only quiet, only rare. Still, suspicion was heavier than fact. The priest suggested a public confession. The master encouraged Mathieu to repent, to clear his name, to say something, even if it wasn't true. But Mathieu didn't lie. He said only, "We were friends," and the silence that followed was louder than any denial. Meanwhile, word reached the road crew. Luke had been beaten by a group of older workers after dark. Not severely, but enough to leave him bruised and limping. He said nothing, fought no one, and kept to himself. Eventually, he asked for reassignment and disappeared from the crew. No one in Saint-Perrin knew where he went after that. Some said he returned north. Others whispered he took work at the docks, where no one asked questions. But Mathieu heard none of it directly. He only knew that Luke hadn't sent word, hadn't written. And that was worse than anything the town had said, because their closeness, once enough to survive the cold, had been turned into silence even between them. That winter, Mathieu wrapped his cloak tighter each night. Not because of frost, but because warmth now came with consequences. And even though the town never convicted him of anything, they had already decided what he was, and worse, who he was without. Which brings us here. When a bond is broken by others' fear, not one's own actions, can it be rebuilt from silence alone? No formal punishment was ever issued. The inquiry faded after weeks of dull conversation, when no new accusations surfaced, and no one stepped forward to demand justice for a crime no one had witnessed. The parish decided not to pursue a trial. There were no stocks, no lashing, not even a sermon by name. The decision was announced in a quiet corner of the church. Let it be laid down. A phrase that meant nothing would happen, and yet everything had already changed. Mathieu was allowed to stay in the workshop, but he no longer shared meals in the master's home. He slept alone now, in a cot wedged behind the storeroom door, between sacks of grain and coils of rope. No one told him he had been exiled within the town, but he was. He was spoken to when necessary and watched when not. Every kindness was measured, every look was calculated. His presence reminded people of what they didn't want to admit could happen in plain sight. That affection might take a form they didn't understand, and that it could live quietly, even in a place as ordinary as a shared bed. He did not see Luke again, not in that year, not in the next. But stories had their ways of travelling, and scraps of rumour became currency. A merchant passing through spoke of a tall boy working as a rope braider in a port town several days west. He didn't name Luke, but described the same squint, the same light hair, the same silence. Mathieu said nothing, but that night he folded a scrap of cloth he'd kept from the loft. a corner of an old blanket they had once patched together, and placed it beneath his mattress. He didn't write, he didn't know where to send a letter. And what would he have said? No court had punished them, but the punishment had landed just the same. He grew older, stronger. His hands roughened, his back broadened. He became a craftsman in his own right. Opened a modest shop near the edge of town. People came to him again, slowly, as if nothing had happened. But something had. He was never accused again, but he was never fully trusted either. Women were polite, but their parents watched closely. Men nodded to him in the street, but never invited him to drink. He became respected and alone, and in the quiet of his shop when no one else remained, he would sometimes rest his palm on the table, where they used to work together. Let his eyes blur, remember the sound of Luke's breathing in the dark, the shared rhythm of rising and sleeping, the kind of closeness that once asked for nothing and gave everything. And still, after all those years, no one ever said his name again. Not in the workshop, not in the street, not even in church, but Mathieu remembered. And in that remembering he defied the silence, because some loves are not meant to last, but are meant to be carried, quietly, honestly, not as shame, but as truth. Her name was Annalise, and she worked in the bakehouse just beyond the monastery wall, where smoke curled low and white into the dawn air. Her hands were always floured, her apron streaked with soot, and her fingers singed more often than not from pulling loaves too early from the oven. But she was quick and quiet and never dropped a tray. That was enough to keep her there. The monastery provided flour in exchange for bread. Each morning a monk came with a tally and a wheelbarrow, and for almost a year Annalise paid him no more attention than she did the firewood stack, until they sent someone new. His name was Brother Mathieu. He was young, sharp-shouldered, soft-voiced. He wore his robes like they weighed more than they did, and always left bits of bark on the soles of his sandals. He took the bread without comment, but he looked at her. Once. Twice. Then longer. At first she avoided his gaze. Then she met it. Then she held it. It began as glances, as most forbidden things do. He said thank you differently, with warmth, with intention. She began marking the loaves with a tiny pressed cross where none was needed. And then, one morning, she handed him a smaller loaf wrapped in cloth. He took it, unwrapped it later, alone. Inside the crust, scratched into the dough with the end of a spoon handle before baking, were words. Simple, crude, faint. I see you. He brought the cloth back the next morning. Folded, Parisianed. No words, but when he left, he looked back. That was enough. It became a ritual. Once a week, no more, they exchanged loaves. Each carried a phrase, nothing blasphemous, nothing lustful, just crumbs of attention. You're not alone. I wait for the morning. You look tired today. Words she scratched into raw dough with her finger, soft as ash, before glazing and sending it into the fire. It was harmless, almost sacred. At least that's what she believed. But then someone else saw. An older monk, sharp-eyed, unsleeping, watched Mathieu unwrap a marked loaf in the corner of the cloister garden. He said nothing, but he told the abbot, and the abbot summoned Mathieu. The monk confessed nothing, but the abbot was old enough to know that denial is rarely honest. He followed the monk the next morning, watched him take the bread, watched Annalise's hand linger on the edge of the basket, watched the glances, the silence, and then he seized the loaf himself, tore it open, and there, beneath the crust, words burned faintly and brown. Will you ever speak to me freely? It was not seduction. It was not treason. But it was enough. Bread was sacred. The Eucharist had made it so, and to write hidden words into dough meant for a monk without permission was considered no longer love, but sorcery. Annalise was summoned. Not gently, the magistrate was called, and within hours the word witchcraft was whispered beneath breath. Because if a woman hides messages in bread, surely she might hide something worse. And if a monk reads them, surely he is bewitched. Which leaves a final breathless question. When love is baked into daily bread, how quickly does it burn once exposed? They questioned her before the flour had settled from the morning's baking. She still wore her apron, still smelled of yeast and smoke. She stood in the corner of the bakehouse while two friars circled her slowly, asking how long she had written the messages, how many loaves she had marked, and whether she had ever intended influence over the spiritual mind of a consecrated brother. The words were too formal, too rehearsed. She answered plainly, I wrote to him. That is all. They called it suspicious. They said scripture was for parchment, not pastry. They said bread was for bodies, not for words. She was not put in chains, not yet. But she was made to stand in the church courtyard at dusk in view of the monastery gates, her hands stained from dough, her eyes burning with fatigue. The loaf in question lay on a cloth-covered table, opened, broken, the phrase half-crusted and nearly unreadable now. Yet still, they pointed to it, not as poetry, as proof. Brother Mathieu was summoned again. He was pale, quiet. His fingers trembled as he folded his hands. He did not deny knowing her. He admitted to receiving the loaves, but he said clearly there was no magic in them, only words. That only deepened suspicion. Because words, after all, were where magic began. The abbot ruled quickly. There would be no trial, only correction. The town would not suffer rumours of enchantment so near sacred walls, and so they prepared the courtyard. Not for fire, not for gallows, but for something quieter. She would be whipped. 5 lashes, enough to prove discipline. Not enough to satisfy the hunger of those who whispered the word witch. The day was dry, windless, the crowd was small, but the silence was large. They tied her to the post beside the chapel wall, where grapes usually dried in the sun. Her back was bared. The friar chosen to carry out the punishment was one who had once eaten her bread every Thursday. He did not meet her eyes. The lashes were quick, not vicious, but not thin, not soft. And when it was over, she was untied without a word. No sermon, no judgment, just the sting of judgment without voice. She did not cry, she did not plead. She gathered her apron from the ground, held it across her chest, and walked home in silence. And Brother Mathieu, he was sent away, not punished, but reassigned. To a monastery 2 days' ride west. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far from bread ovens and the village walls. He left that night, and never saw her again. But days later, the boy who swept the cloisters found something tucked behind the ledger near the bakehouse, pressed between sheets of wax paper, a crust of bread, and beneath it scratched into a torn piece of parchment. I was not trying to change him, only to reach him. The boy brought it to no one. He kept it in his pocket, because even a child knew. Sometimes it isn't spells that frighten people most, it's honesty, especially when baked into something as holy as bread. The scars healed quickly, but the silence did not. Annalise returned to the bakehouse the following week, earlier than anyone expected. She wore a new apron stitched by her aunt, and kept her sleeves longer than before even as the weather warmed. The townspeople did not shun her. That would have made too much noise. They simply bought their bread without small talk. No compliments, no questions, just coins on the table and eyes that drifted elsewhere. She didn't mind, or if she did, she didn't show it. She worked more efficiently than before, measured flour by the weight of her hand, cut each loaf with the same rhythm as always, but she no longer pressed words into the dough. She no longer folded cloth around private loaves. Her hands, though clean, now moved as if something had been taken from them. The oven still burned hot each morning. The bread still rose, but nothing more was sent inside it. Brother Mathieu was never mentioned again. Not by the friars, not by the nuns, not even in the slow-dripped gossip at the well. He became like the soot inside the chimney, present, but untouchable, and slowly forgotten by all but one. Annalise kept baking. She aged slowly as bakers do, browned by the heat, stiffened by repetition, marked by flour that never fully left the creases of the skin. She did not marry. She said it was the work. Said no man wanted a woman whose hands always smelled of yeast and charcoal. People nodded, but they knew there was more. They just didn't ask. Once, years later, a new novice asked her about the burn mark on the beam above the oven, the faint imprint of a cross surrounded by smoke. Was it an accident? The girl asked. Annalisa looked up, blinked once, and said, "No, it was a warning, or a prayer, or both." The girl asked no more. The parchment the boy had found, Mathieu's final message, had never been claimed. He kept it until he left the village himself years later to work in a scribe's shop by the coast. He never knew if the words had reached her, but he remembered the phrase, repeated it often to himself. I was not trying to change him, only to reach him. In the end, the story faded. The whispers dulled, and Annalise remained, steady, unmarried, flower-streaked, and oddly revered by those too young to remember why. They called her wise. They said she could calm a fever with only tea and honey. They said she prayed at odd hours, but what they never said, what no one dared to say aloud, was that once a woman had written gentle words inside warm bread and the world decided it was dangerous. Her name was Elaine, and she had not worn black in 3 years, though the villagers still called her the Widow. Her husband, Gerard, had been the town's only blacksmith, a man with hands like iron and a temper to match. He had died quickly in spring with soot still under his nails. The forge stood quiet for weeks after, the tools untouched, the coals gone cold. Elaine, in her quiet, sharp-eyed way, had not wept in public. She had simply sold the horseshoes at half price and boarded the shutters before winter. The forge became her home after that. She slept in the loft above the bellows, where the heat once rose and warmed the bones of the place. She kept the anvil covered, kept the front locked. No one knew what she did with her days. Some said she prayed too often. Others said she spoke to no one, but no one pressed. Then came the pilgrim. It was early autumn, and the roads were full of travellers heading west toward the shrine of St. Michel. Dusty robes, cracked sandals, calloused feet. Most passed through the village without stopping. They took bread, left prayers, and moved on, but this one stayed. His name was Jules. He came with a limp and a voice too soft for a man who'd crossed 3 provinces. He asked for shelter, just for a night. Elaine said yes. No one thought it strange. Hospitality was sacred. But then he stayed a second night. And a third. She gave no reason. He gave no explanation. By the 5th evening, someone asked the baker's son, who lived 2 doors down, what he'd seen. Nothing, he said, and she leaves the door unlatched now, Dahor. That was enough. The next Sunday, the priest mentioned temptation in his sermon. The neighbour left a loaf on her doorstep, unsliced, and a message was delivered by the alderman's apprentice. Pilgrims are meant to walk. Still, Jules stayed. He helped stack firewood. He drew water from the well. He cleaned the rust from the forge tools, though the fire was never lit. They did not walk side by side. They did not share bread in public. But one evening, as the sun fell red over the chimney stones, Elaine stepped out from the forge and found him waiting, holding a piece of iron shaped like a heart, rough, incomplete, the curve barely formed. He handed it to her. She did not smile, but she did not let go. And someone saw. They always do. The next morning, a woman selling herbs refused to speak to Elaine. 2 boys passed the forge and spat. By dusk, the alderman knocked. He did not threaten. He only said, "You must choose. He is not of this village." And she, in her quiet voice, replied, "Then let him stay, and call him so." But they would not, because to accept him meant accepting her choice, and that was more than the village was willing to bear. Which leaves us wondering, whoa, what do you lose when you let someone stay, after the world has decided they should leave? The threat didn't come with fire or fists. It came in smaller, sharper forms. Refusals, omissions, silences. The well was suddenly always crowded when Elaine approached. The grain merchant sold her the last of the barrel, though she'd arrived early. The priest no longer nodded as she passed the chapel gate. None of it was spoken aloud, and that made it worse. Jules offered to leave. He said it one morning while stacking kindling behind the forge. "If it causes you trouble, I can go before dusk." Elaine didn't answer right away. She dusted flour from her hands, turned back to the hearth, and only said, "You haven't finished cleaning the tongs." It was the closest thing she ever gave to affection. He stayed. They lived simply, quietly. He slept by the forge, not above it. She cooked what little she bought, and they ate near the anvil where her husband once pounded iron. No one touched the bellows. They didn't light the forge. It remained a relic of the past, sacred and undisturbed. But somehow, Jules' presence softened the air inside, as if someone had opened a window in a room long shut. She had buried Gerard alone. No priest had come. He'd died suddenly, and by the time they found him, the rites had passed. She'd dug the shallow grave herself and laid him under the twisted ash tree. No headstone, just a blackened horseshoe nailed to the bark. That was all. So now, when they called her disloyal, she said nothing. Because she had already honoured the dead. Now she would choose the living. The whispers grew. They said the pilgrim had bewitched her, that he was no pilgrim at all, that he'd stolen something sacred, that he had plans, and still, no evidence, only distance, only a village that believed it had a right to decide how long grief should last and who was worthy to break it. One afternoon, 2 men from the parish council stood outside the forge and waited. They did not knock. They simply stood, arms crossed, staring at the door until Jules opened it. They said, "The council requests you leave by week's end," he asked. "By what cause?" they replied. "By none, but you are not wanted." Jules nodded, said he would speak to Elaine. They left without another word. That evening, when he told her, she didn't argue. She said only, "I'll pack your bread, but you will wait for me at the gate." And so, 5 days later, with no blessings, no farewells, and no accusations made official, Jules stood at the village gate as Elaine walked the full length of the square behind him, basket in hand, cloak over her shoulders, face unreadable. They didn't speak as they passed the onlookers, didn't pause as the baker stepped aside, lips pressed tight, didn't turn when the priest looked away. But at the edge of the road, Jules asked, "You're leaving too?" She nodded and said, "No one gets to tell me when I've mourned enough." They walked beyond the trees, past the markers of the village boundary, toward no fixed destination, but side by side, and when night fell and they stopped to rest beneath the turning leaves, Elaine took out a piece of parchment, creased, smudged, and handed it to him. On it, the sketch of a horseshoe, bent, fractured, reforged into the shape of a circle, which leads us here. When the world cannot punish love by fire, it punishes by corns. But what happens when two people walk far enough that the silence no longer follows? Hay didn't settle right away. The road was long and uneven, lined with trees that dropped their leaves too early, and streams that rarely ran straight. Jules carried most of the weight. Elaine carried what mattered, her tools, her bread knife, folded cloth containing the smallest items left from her past life, a thimble, a brass button from her husband's cloak, and the iron heart Jules had once shaped for her. They slept in barns when offered, in corners of abandoned chapels when not. People asked no questions. To those they met, they were just a traveller and a widow. There was nothing strange about either. Only in Low Elm had their quiet companionship been judged. Out here it was unremarkable, even ordinary. In a village 2 days south, they stayed long enough to repair a crumbling fence. Jules carved new pegs, Elaine boiled pitch and taught a boy to temper nails over a borrowed flame. She didn't mention the forge she had once swept daily. She didn't mention Gerard. But when she lit the small fire, her fingers moved with the muscle memory of grief and grit alike. They stayed a week, then moved on. Eventually, they reached a town with a chapel large enough to hold its own bell tower and a forge in disrepair. The blacksmith was old, blind in one eye. He asked Jules to help. Elaine offered to keep the ledger. They were hired within the day. They took a room above the stables. It was small, draughty, lined with straw and perfect. She folded their things into corners. He unpacked his sandals and mended them with thread from her bag. No declarations were made. No wedding band passed between them. But each morning they rose together, ate together, returned home together, and that was enough. The town asked no questions. The smith praised their work. The neighbours spoke little, but smiled often. And slowly their names began to settle into the market stalls and the side streets. Elaine became the woman who could fix a broken latch with 3 strokes and a pinch of ash. Jules became the man who didn't speak loudly, but who always noticed when a cartwheel was failing. They belonged. Not by birth, but by effort. Years later, no one remembered where they had come from. No one recalled the village where she had once been told how long she should grieve, or where he had been warned not to overstay his welcome. They lived together for years, never officially married, but never questioned. And when Jules died one autumn morning, peacefully in sleep, his hand still warm beside hers, Elaine did not weep aloud. She placed the iron heart he had once given her atop the small box where his belongings were folded, and then she walked to the forge and lit the fire again. She worked that day, not out of obligation, but because she knew how to move through loss. The town did not ask for explanations. They only brought bread. Later, when she was older than anyone else on her street, a young girl once asked her if she had ever been in love. Elaine smiled, thought for a moment, then said, "He stayed longer than he was meant to. That was enough." They hadn't meant for it to be secret. Not at first. Elric had gone to her father as tradition demanded, with his cap in hand and boots freshly scrubbed. He brought a goose, plucked and dressed, and a silver coin earned from 2 months of millwork. He spoke plainly. He said he loved her, that he would work, that he'd keep her warm. Her father did not say no. He didn't say yes either. He only grunted, said, "We'll speak later," and then shut the door. They waited for days, then a week. Her name was Lena, and she was not patient by nature. But for Elric she tried. They met only in daylight, always in sight of the road, always a hand's width apart, but people still noticed. And when another suitor arrived, older, with land, a brother in the clergy, and a small silver cross tucked into his collar, Lena's father made his choice, not with a seach, not with an announcement, only with a single phrase at supper: "You'll be betrothed before all saints." Lena left the table before the bread was passed. She found Elric before the sun had fully set, and that night, beneath the elder tree where the road bent toward the hills, they made their vows. There was no priest, no witnesses, no dowry, just hands clasped tightly, words spoken low, and hearts that believed they could shape a future with nothing more than honesty. It wasn't recognised, of course, not by the village, not by her father, but it was real, and realness has its own gravity. They met in secret after that, carefully, with purpose, and when her belly began to swell with the early bloom of new life, it was the midwife who saw it first. She said nothing at first, only watched Lena's hands tremble as she kneaded the bread, noticed the way she sat slower on the stool, how her eyes darted more often to the road. But when the signs became clear, the midwife asked the question with no softness. Was it the mill boy? Lena nodded. Once, she did not explain, did not confess. But the midwife, bound by duty and pulled by judgment, told the priest. The priest told the father, and by week's end the truth had outrun them both. Elric was summoned, not to confess, to be condemned. They were told their marriage was no marriage. Their vows were words in the dark. No coin had changed hands. No priest had offered blessing. No father had given consent. And so they were not husband and wife. Only girl and boy, guilty. She was sent back to her father's house. He was beaten once and sent to the fields. And still, they believed what they had done was not wrong, only unrecognised. Which leaves the question, so simple yet so old. When two people know they are bound, why does the world demand they prove it? Elric didn't speak during his beating. He grit his teeth, not from pride, but from the bitter understanding that pain would not change minds. Each lash across his back was not meant to correct a wrong, it was meant to erase a story they had tried to write for themselves, without ink or approval. When it was over, he was left in the shed behind the chapel, blood drying against his shirt, and no one came for him, not even Lena. But he didn't blame her. He knew she was being kept just as tightly as he was punished. Her father refused to speak her name. Her meals were brought to her in silence. Her room became a cage, bare, still, filled with the sound of withheld judgment. The belly that now curved gently beneath her tunic made every hour louder, not with sound, but with implication. And implication in a medieval village carried more force than proof. The priest visited her on the third day. He came not to offer comfort, but correction. He spoke of sin, of deception, of how a woman's body was not hers to give, and how promises made beneath trees held no weight beside those made beneath altars. She did not cry. She only asked once, "Is a vow nothing if it's spoken in truth?" He said nothing. She was told to prepare for public penance, not for her child, but for her disobedience. The child was not yet her shame. The secret was. Meanwhile, Elric had not fled. He could have. Others had. Boys who knocked at wrong doors or kissed the wrong hands, but he stayed. Because leaving meant the world was right, and he was wrong, and he wasn't. Not in his heart, not in the quiet moment when he had promised Lena that no matter how the world changed, he would not. So he worked. He rebuilt a broken cart for a farmer too old to bend. He mended a roof tile in exchange for bread. He slept in a stable, where the cows breathed warm in the night. People didn't stop him, but they didn't look at him either. Until Lena was brought to the church steps. It was a clear morning, windless, the kind of day when every footstep echoed. She was dressed in grey, not black, because mourning was not allowed. Her hair was loose, her hands bound at the wrist. She stood before the door and was made to recite the prayer of the penitent. But when the priest asked her to name the man, she said, "My husband." The gasp was quiet, but it reached the edges of the crowd. The priest paused, stiffened, said, "You are not wed." She looked at him, said only, "You were not there." He said no more, but the midwife standing at the back shook her head. Lena's father turned away, and Elric, watching from the edge of the square, stepped forward. He said nothing, but he stood beside her. That too was enough. Enough to cause unrest, enough to start murmurs, enough to make the priest end the penance early, for fear of what might be said next. They were not mkusa, married in the eyes of the church, but they had stood together when the world asked them to step back. And in time, that act became its own form of marriage, not one recorded, not one recognised, but one remembered, which leaves only this. If two people say "I do," and no one hears it but the stars, was it any less real than the vows spoken beneath stained glass? They never received a blessing, not from the church, not from her father, not even from the midwife who had once held her shoulders in silence. But they built a life anyway. It didn't start with ceremony or song. It started with a small cottage outside the village boundary, half-roofed, with a door that didn't close properly and no hearthstone at all. They traded work for wood, for oats, for cloth, and when the child came, a girl with soft lungs and a fierce grip, they named her Lena, after no one in particular because they owed nothing to the past. Lena's father never visited, nor did he send anyone. But he didn't stop the mason from selling stone for their chimney. He didn't stop the neighbour from passing old wool through the fence. Sometimes silence was not hatred. Sometimes it was quiet permission carved by pride. The priest refused to baptise the child, so Elric poured river water over her forehead himself, with Lena holding the swaddled bundle against her chest and whispering prayers half-learned, half-invented. The world didn't stop, the sky didn't crack, the child didn't cry. It was enough. People still whispered, though, not cruelly, but curiously. They live without sanction. She bears his name, though she was never given it properly. They call him husband, though he never paid the dowry. But their whispers dulled with each passing harvest, because Elric kept fences mended, because Lena gave strong cloth to the washerwoman with no coin, because the child grew strong and smiled at everyone. Time, more than reason, softened the village. And by the 5th year, when smoke rose steadily from their chimney and herbs hung in neat lines beneath the eaves, the village no longer questioned their marriage. They simply stopped needing to. The priest never changed his mind. But he nodded at them once, at market, and that was enough. Lena never returned to the church steps, never asked to rewrite her name in the parish roll, but she walked with Elric each Sunday past the chapel, hand in hand, past the children whose eyes held no judgment, only questions, and then laughter. They had no wedding date to celebrate, no written record, no ring, but they had a table that creaked from shared meals, a bed that stayed warm through winter, and a daughter who learned to walk on the same ground where her parents had once stood accused. And one day, many years later, when that daughter asked how they had married, Lena smiled and said, "We didn't need permission, only each other." Brother Henri was known for rising early, earlier even than the bell that called the brothers to matins. He said it was the quiet that stirred him, not the rule. That God could be heard more clearly when the dew still clung to the grass. No one questioned him. He had a gentle way about him. His robe was always neat, his sandals always clean. He was the kind of monk others trusted to carry candles and copy sermons without error. But Henri also had a habit that wasn't written into the rule book. Each morning, before the first prayer, he left the chapel by the eastern path and walked just far enough into the woods that the crows could not hear the bells. And there, beneath an old elm split by lightning a generation ago, stood a man with a falcon on his arm. His name was Corin. He was not of the monastery, not of the village either. He came from the moorland east of the hills, where his father had raised birds for lords who wanted something noble to hold. Corin did not wear robes. He wore leather and a belt of knives, and sometimes blood from a morning kill. But his hands, despite their calluses, were steady, especially when touching wings. Henri had met him by chance, 3 seasons ago, when one of the abbey's novices had wandered too far from the path. The boy had startled a nesting hawk and run blindly into the woods. Henri had followed, found the boy cowering beneath a tree, and found Corin there already calming the hawk with a whistle so soft it could barely be heard. Henri had thanked him. Corin had nodded, and they had not spoken again until a week later, when Henri returned to the same grove, alone. They talked about the birds first, then about tenants, then about how both of them found more peace in the trees than within stone walls. Their meetings were brief, 15 minutes, 20 at most. Henri always returned before the first bell, but slowly those few stolen minutes began to feel like the centre of the day. Corin never asked why a monk would come into the woods. Henri never asked why a falconer lingered so near holy ground. They didn't need to. They knew. They never touched. Not then. but the silence between them grew gentler, and one morning Corin brought Henri a feather, long, dark, still warm from a molted wing. Henri took it with both hands and placed it between the pages of his psalter. But quiet things rarely stay quiet forever. A novice, sent early to gather kindling, saw them at the edge of the trees. He told the sub-prior, who told the abbot, who said nothing at first, but watched Henri more closely in the chapel, and counted the pages in his psalter, until he found the feather, and everything changed. Because in a world built on ritual, a single feather was too loud to ignore, which leaves only this: when silence is no longer permitted, where do two people go who have only ever spoken without words? Brother Henri was called to the abbot's chamber after none, not with urgency, not with wrath, just a quiet nod passed down from the sub-prior, and a gesture that told Henri not to bring his psalter. That, more than anything, told him what kind of conversation it would be. The chamber smelled of candle wax and damp wood. A breeze pushed against the shutter, but none of the monks moved to close it. The abbot held the feather. It was folded between two fingers, as if it might still try to fly. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Henri didn't lie. He said, "From a falconer. He visits the woods east of the chapel path." "And why would a falconer give you a feather?" Henri paused, chose silence. The abbot waited, then said, "The rule is clear. We live in obedience, in simplicity, in chastity, not only of flesh, but of attention. You have given yours to someone outside these walls." Henri did not argue. He only said, "I have never broken my vows." The abbot looked at the feather again, as if trying to decide whether belief could be built from such a thing. Then he folded it into a piece of cloth and said, "You will no longer walk east before prayer." Henri bowed, returned to his cell, and did not sleep that night. The next morning the bells rang without him. He stayed in bed, though he wasn't ill, at least not in body. When he finally rose, he walked not east, but to the west cloister, where the novices cleaned inkstones and chased leaves from the corridor. He said nothing, did nothing, just stood in a place where he could not see the trees. Corin, meanwhile, returned to the grove, twice, then 3 times, but no monk appeared, no quiet figure stepping between roots, no gentle greeting, only sadness. On the 4th morning he left something at the base of the elder tree, a length of the leather cord tied in a knot used by falconers to tether a bird, one designed to hold but not to hurt. Henri never saw it, but the novice did, and gave it to the sub-prior, and the message became clear. They had not touched, but they had chosen, and in a monastery choosing, without permission, was the danger. Henri was summoned again. This time the abbot spoke more softly. He said, "You have not broken your vows, but you have given your peace to someone outside our walls. That is enough." Henri asked, "Will I be punished?" The abbot shook his head. "No," he said, "but you will be moved." A transfer to a house in the north, smaller, stricter, where the trees were farther from the walls. Henri did not protest, but before he left, he returned, just once, to the grove. There, beneath the elder tree, he found a falcon's footprint in the soft earth, pressed deeply into the mud. No feather, no message, but enough to know Corin had come, enough to remember. And when Henri turned back toward the chapel, heart heavy, he whispered, not to the wind, not to God, but to the quiet air, "We never touched, but we were held." The northern house was colder, tighter. The walls were thicker and the windows smaller, designed not for beauty but for control. Here, brother Henri was no longer early to rise. The routines were stricter, the bells louder, the prayers longer. The abbot, older and sterner than the last, never smiled. There was no path to wander, no grove to visit, only stone rule and quiet that no longer brought peace. Still, Henri did not rebel. He copied his texts, cleaned the floors, whispered the psalms with measured breath. But something in him had stilled, not out of surrender, but out of preservation. He no longer folded margins with care, no longer shaped his letters with pride. He moved through the days like a man trying to avoid disturbing still water, and no one noticed, because he never spoke of longing. Except, perhaps once. There was a new novice, a boy young enough to ask questions. One evening he watched Henri as he swept the apse in fading light and asked, "Do you miss where you came from?" Henri paused, then said only, "Some places teach you to pray, Others teach you what it means to be heard. He left it at that. Meanwhile, far from the cloister, Corin continued with his birds. They were quieter now too. He no longer whistled for them to land on strangers' arms. He no longer performed for travellers. He trained them only for the hunt, and even then, only alone. He moved from village to village, never staying long, but he always paused when he passed stone walls, always watched the high windows, searching for a flicker of linen, of movement, of someone watching back. Years passed. Henri's hair greyed at the temples. His hands shook slightly when holding a pen. He had copied the same Psalter 7 times, but he never let his writing falter, not once, not because of duty, but because it was the one place he could still leave something behind. A curve, a gesture, a rhythm someone else might recognise. Then one winter, a package arrived. No seal, no sender, just a small box wrapped in oilskin and twine. Inside, a feather. Not from a falcon, but from a kestrel, smaller, flecked with rust red, and tied to it, style for a cord, knotted in the same tethering style used by falconers to hold a bird gently, but never tightly. Henri said nothing. He tucked the feather into the back of his psalter, between the canticles and the blank flyleaf. That evening, during Vespers, he sang softly for the first time in years. He never wrote to Corin. There was no address, no name, no need. Because they had never built their closeness on words, only on presence, on morning light filtered through leaves, on the space between rules, on the knowledge that being seen, truly seen, was, in itself, a kind of belonging. Henri died in that northern house years later, remembered as a quiet brother, a careful scribe. They found the feather only after he had passed. None of the monks knew what it meant, but one novice kept it, placed it between his own books, and one day, years later, while walking through the edge of a forest with his psalter tucked under his arm, he paused beneath an old elm tree and thought he heard wings. They called her Beatrice, though the name had not belonged to her at birth. It was chosen later, during her baptism at age 7, when her father declared her old enough to be seen, no longer a mouth to feed, but a future to trade. Her real name, the one her mother whispered to her beneath quilts during storms, faded like the lace on her christening dress. Forgotten by others, remembered only in the way she hesitated when introducing herself. Her father was a merchant, a proud man with boots cleaner than his conscience, and ledgers filled with flour, salt, and debts, collected with smiles sharp as sickles. He had 3 daughters, 2 already married, and Beatrice, the youngest, the quietest, the one who read too much and spoke too little. The suitor arrived in late spring. His name was Allard, twice her age, and 3 times as sure of himself. He wore rings on every finger, and spoke with the kind of patience that feels like waiting to pounce. He called her my future jewel, before even asking if she played music. He laughed too loudly, especially at his own silence, and he brought a dowry gift of a silver hairpin shaped like a serpent. Her father was delighted. Beatrice was not. When she was summoned to the parlour and told the match was to be announced by midsummer, she said nothing at first. Her silence was mistaken for shyness, but when asked directly, "Do you accept him?" she looked up slowly and answered with only one word. "No." Her mother's hands froze where they had been smoothing her apron. Her father did not blink. He simply rose and said, "You will." She repeated, "I will not." The house changed that day. The hallway outside her room gained a lock. The windows were nailed halfway shut. Her books, half of them, were taken. The rest were left to her as if to remind her what obedience could earn. Meals were brought and not spoken over. Visitors were turned away. And Beatrice, who had never raised her voice or broken a rule in her life, became an outlaw in her own home. Allard was not dismissed. He returned often. He brought perfumes she never touched, gloves she never wore, a small songbird in a cage she refused to name. He was told she was unwell. He smiled as though that pleased him. She wrote letters, to her sisters, to the abbess at a nearby convent, to the clerk's daughter who once taught her how to hold a quill without blotting. Most of the letters were never sent. Her father had eyes everywhere, but writing helped. It reminded her that she still had words, even if no one heard them. And then, one evening, she made a choice. Not dramatic, not desperate, just clear. She refused to attend supper, then refused again, and again. By the 4th day, her father came to her door with the priest. He said, "Obedience is your salvation." She replied, "Obedience is your comfort." The priest left that day with a furrowed brow, and Beatrice, thin, silent, but unbroken, stared out the tiny window above her cot and whispered the name her mother had given her at birth. It was the first time she had said it aloud in 10 years, which leads us here. When a girl is given no choices but still chooses, what will they take next? The room was never locked, not officially, but the message was clear. She would not leave, not until she obeyed. The servants were instructed not to speak to her unless necessary. Her meals, thinner now, were brought and left at the threshold. The hallway grew quieter. Doors no longer opened with her footsteps. Even the birds outside her narrow window seemed to perch farther from view. Beatrice counted the bricks in her wall, then the boards in the ceiling. She read what remained of her books slowly, then reread them backward. And each evening she wrote, not letters this time, but questions. In the margins of a page she folded carefully and slid between the cracks in her bed frame. Questions like, who decides what love should feel like? What makes a promise real if no one says yes? Can a voice be stolen if it was never allowed to speak? No one answered, but still, she wrote. Her father grew impatient. Allard visited again and was told the girl is being shaped. He smirked and offered to assist. That night, the hallway outside Beatrice's door filled with the sound of hushed arguments. Her mother's voice rose, once, just once, and then never again. In the days that followed, the seamstress arrived. Uninvited, unannounced. She came with bolts of white cloth and hands that measured quickly. Beatrice stood still as pins pressed close to her collar. She said nothing, but her eyes did not look away. "You'll make a fine bride," the seamstress said quietly. "I won't be a bride," Beatrice replied. And the woman, perhaps not meaning to, whispered back, "You're not the first to say that." The dress was sewn anyway, the wedding date set, but no banns were read, because reading them would invite the town to see what they were doing, and secrecy suited them better. Her mother brought a small comb to her room one morning, ivory curved like a crescent moon. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said, placing it on the windowsill, then added, "You can still run." Beatrice stared at her. "You'd help me?" "I can't," her mother whispered, "but I won't stop you." The next night she packed nothing, just a single folded page from under the bed. She left barefoot, while the moon still hung high and the house breathed its slow, sleeping rhythm. She walked east, toward the abbey, toward anything, toward herself. They searched, of course. The town was stirred, but not loudly. Her father told the priest she'd gone mad with fasting. Allard left, red-faced and insulted, but no notice was nailed to any door, no hue and cry, because to announce her disappearance was to admit they had lost, and men like her father preferred a quiet shame over a public truth. At the abbey, she was received not as a penitent, but as a guest. The abbess, older and sharper than expected, read her letter without expression, then said simply, "We've known too many girls who arrive carrying nothing but a name they were never allowed to speak." Which leads us here. When the world demands obedience in exchange for a name, what happens when a girl remembers the one she was born with? At the abbey, she was not asked to confess, not right away. The sisters gave her a bed, a basin, and silence. It was the most generous thing anyone had offered her in years. She slept for 2 days, her dreams heavy with footsteps and locked doors, with the clink of rings she never wanted, and a name she had never chosen. When she woke, the abbess returned with a ledger and a single question. "What name shall I record?" Beatrice paused, then whispered the name her mother had spoken only once in the hush of a night long past. "Isolde." It did not sound like defiance, it sounded like breath returning to a body. The abbess wrote it without comment. She joined the garden rotation the next week, dug her hands into earth, picked stones from roots, planted bulbs she'd never see bloom. She said little, but began to hum. Her fingers regained colour. Her silence grew easier, not because she had forgotten, but because she no longer had to defend herself inside it. No one from her family came, not a note, not a messenger, but she heard from a travelling wool merchant that her father claimed she had been struck with melancholy and had taken vows early. A choice, he insisted, out of piety. She smiled when she heard that. It was easier to be a runaway nun than a girl who had simply said no. The comb her mother had given her she kept wrapped in cloth, tucked beside her small psalter. She never used it, but she touched it sometimes, as a reminder. not of her mother's silence, but of her courage inside it. She never saw Allard again, but she heard through whispers that he had married another, a young girl from the next parish over. Dowry secured, head lowered, Isolde wondered if that girl had ever said no, and if anyone had listened. She took no vows, not at the abbey, not for years. She worked, lived, prayed, and remained. She copied texts by hand eventually, her lettering crisp, her lines even. And once, when binding a book of saints' lives, she slipped a blank page at the end. On it, she wrote no name, only the words, "I chose." No one ever found it, but that didn't matter. She had left a trace. One day, years later, a visitor arrived. A young girl, nervous, quiet, escorted by a parish priest who said she was difficult at home. The abbess welcomed her. Isolde helped her unpack. The girl asked, "Will they make me take vows?" And Isolde, who had once been Beatrice, answered gently, "No one here will ask you for anything except the truth." And outside the walls, the house she had fled stood still, a window nailed shut, a dress never worn, a page torn out of the family ledger. But she had written her name elsewhere now, and no one could take it back. They waited until the Feast of St. Catherine. It was the only day when the village emptied long enough for no one to notice two lovers slipping away through the south gate. Martin had timed it precisely. He knew the rhythm of the festival, how long the procession circled the chapel when the bells would drown out the sound of horse hooves. He'd stolen a cart from the miller's son, promising to return it before dusk. Ismay brought only a satchel, a ribbon, and the small silver pin her grandmother had worn at her own wedding. They weren't running from scandal, they were running from delay. Martin had asked her father's blessing 3 times. Each time he was told, "Come back when you have more to offer. More land, more goats, more coin." The conditions changed with each visit, but the answer remained the same. And Ismay, who had watched 3 of her friends marry men they had met only after the banns were read, said finally, "Let's not wait until we're old enough to regret it." So they rode east toward the next parish. They knew of a chapel there, a small cracked thing beside a barley field, where the priest was known for asking fewer questions when coin was placed in hand. They were married at sunset. No hymns, no feast, only the scent of hay, the thin chant of a tired cleric, and their own hands knotted around a ribbon Ismay had carried since she was a child. They returned just before the second bell of night prayer, quietly, hoping no one had noticed. But someone always does. The miller's son recognized the dirt on his wheels, the baker's daughter saw the ribbon tied at Ismay's neck, and the priest, summoned by the alderman, declared the marriage invalid. Wrong parish. No banns, no father's consent. It was legal, perhaps, but not righteous. So the council ruled, if they wanted to stay in the village, they would be made to stand as an example, not to deny their love, but to show that even love must bow to law. They were ordered to stand at the church door for 1 hour, chained, not cruelly, but clearly, side by side, so all might see what came from impatience. It was winter when the sentence came. The stones were cold beneath their feet, the chain wrapped loosely around their wrists, fastened through a ring bolted to the chapel's frame. They said nothing. They didn't cry. And when the bell struck the hour, they didn't pull away. They simply turned to one another and smiled, which leaves a question still whispered in corners. When love breaks no law but timing, why must it be punished with iron? When the bell struck the final note, the sexton came to unfasten the chain. He didn't speak, just fiddled with the clasp, avoiding their eyes. Ismay's fingers were red from cold. Martin's lips were pale, but neither of them trembled. They stepped down from the stone platform together and walked home the long way, past the empty square, past shuttered doors, past the fields dusted with frost. The village did not cheer their release, nor did it jeer. It simply watched, in that way small places do, quiet, sharp-eyed and unwilling to forget. The punishment was over, but the memory stayed. They returned to Martin's small cottage, built at the edge of the mill pond. It was too far from the chapel to hear the morning bells and too close to the woods for most people's comfort. But it had a dry roof and a warm hearth. Ismay unpacked her satchel, hung her wedding ribbon beside the fire. They sat together that evening in silence, not out of sorrow but out of something harder to name. Something like resolve. The next day no one came, not her father, not the priest, not even the baker, who had once promised to set aside the sweetest crusts for her first feast as a bride. But the following week, a boy arrived with a bundle of thatched reeds, then a girl with an apron full of cracked eggs. No one said welcome, but someone always does eventually. Their marriage was never blessed again. The priest refused. The chapel door for months remained a place people avoided. Some said it had been desecrated, others said it had merely been used, and they weren't sure which was worse. Martin returned to his work, shaping cartwheels, sharpening ploughs. Ismay began keeping hens. They kept to themselves, not out of shame, but to let the noise die down. And eventually it did. Whispers shifted to new things. A wandering monk with strange eyes, a girl said to be hiding a book not written in Latin. But Ismay and Martin, they endured. People said they were quiet. People said they were strange. But when children passed their home and asked, "Why don't they go to church?" the mothers replied, "They have their own." And it was true. Each Sunday, Martin laid a cloth on the table. Ismay lit a single taper. They bowed their heads and held hands. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't read from a book. They just sat in silence, grateful that even if they'd been bound in front of stone once, they'd done it for a love they'd already chosen. Which leads us gently toward the close of this part. When two people make a vow and no one else believes it, how long does it take before that vow becomes sacred anyway? Years passed quietly, as most true vows do. The church chain that once wrapped their wrists rusted by spring was removed by summer and forgotten by autumn. Only the iron ring remained, bolted into the chapel's doorframe. Children touched it and asked, "What's this for?" And mothers answered, "Disobedience." But no one told the full story. They left out the part where the couple had smiled. Martin and Ismay lived simply. He carved tools, she raised chickens and sold eggs when people were willing to buy. Not everyone was. There were still those who believed their marriage brought discomfort to the soil, that crops nearest their cottage grew slower, that misfortune took root wherever vows weren't sanctioned by a priest's hand. But misfortune never came. They had no children, but they were never lonely. Their home became a place where travellers rested, where orphans found bread, where silence sat not as punishment but as peace. Every year, on the anniversary of their vow, remembered only by them, they returned to the little chapel outside the village where they had first been wed. The cracked walls now leaned sideways, and the priest who once mumbled through their binding was long buried. But the elm still stood, and there, beneath it, they would sit. Not to repeat their promises, not even to speak, just to be near the place where they'd once said yes without waiting for permission. In the village, their reputation shifted slowly. The ones who once whispered began to send their children to Martin for tools, asked Ismay for herbs when fevers ran high. Some even nodded when they passed. No one apologised. But acceptance often arrives without ceremony. The priest who replaced the one who condemned them never mentioned their name from the pulpit. But when he saw them walking hand in hand past the chapel on market day, he did not look away. And one day, many years later, when Martin passed quietly in his sleep, Ismay buried him herself. Beneath the elder tree, without sermon, without chant. She placed the same ribbon they'd used to bind their hands in the grave, then sat beside the mound until the sun dipped low and the birds hushed. She stayed in their home, tending the garden they'd planted together. And every so often a child would ask her, "Is it true you were once chained to a church door?" She would smile gently and say, "Only for an hour, but we stayed together ever after." Because the truth was this: the world had bound them in iron, but they had bound themselves in love, and that was harder to break. Her name was Thera, though in the village of Grevenfeld she was rarely called by it. She was known simply as the priest's daughter, a title that sounded like a blessing, but often felt like a burden. Her father, Father Henrik, had served the parish for 22 years, strict, joyless, and iron-willed in both his sermons and his supper prayers. Her mother had died in childbirth, and so Thera was raised not in a family, but in a rectory made of stone and rules. She obeyed. Always. She sat still through Latin recitations, folded her hands even when alone, wore only black and brown and never sang above a whisper. And though she was of marriageable age, no suitor dared ask for her hand. Not because she was unkind or unlovely, but because she was his. But then came the weaver. Jonas was new to Grevenfeld, sent from his guild in a nearby city after a dispute left him without workshop or roof. The village needed cloth and he needed quiet, so they offered him both, a single-room cottage and access to the sheep wool stored in the market granary. He was older than Thera by a handful of winters, though not many. His face was gentle, his hands always moving. And unlike the other men of the village, he did not speak loudly. He did not try to impress. He only spoke to her once, on the day she brought a basket of bread to the old widow next door. He said, "Your braid is neat." She nodded. Nothing more, but it stayed with her. Over the weeks, she walked past the weaver's cottage often. Not too close, never alone, but enough to glimpse him at the loom, the steady rhythm of thread over thread, shuttle over warp. She began to listen for that sound when the wind blew east. Then came the first rainstorm of spring. She was walking home late from the chapel, arms full of leftover bread, when the clouds burst open like a cracked pail. She ducked beneath the nearest overhang, an awning outside Jonas's door. He opened it before she knocked, said nothing, just stepped aside. She didn't enter, but she stood near him until the rain stopped. He offered her a cloth to dry her hands. She took it. That was all, but it was enough. From then on they watched one another. She brought wool left behind at the rectory. He left small scraps of dyed thread in her path, blues, golds, even a ribbon of crimson. Nothing was said, but it grew, until one afternoon behind the chapel garden wall he reached for her hand. And she didn't pull away. They kissed only once, but in a village this small once was plenty. They were seen, and they were not equal. She was the priest's daughter. He was a man with no land, no kin, and a past too vague to protect him. So when word reached Father Henrik, it was not Jonas who was summoned. It was Thera. He asked her no questions. He only said, "You have shamed this house." She stood still, said only, "I loved him." He replied, "Then you may answer for both of you." Jonas was never questioned. He was gone by nightfall. And Thera, she was placed behind locked shutters and told to pray. Which leaves us at the edge of this sorrow. When love crosses a boundary drawn in stone, why is it always one who pays for two? The loom was silent the next morning. The window of Jonas's cottage stood open, curtain fluttering with no hands to draw it shut. His tools were gone. His thread, too, except one strand of red that had slipped between floorboards and remained, unnoticed by all but the wind. No one spoke of him. He had vanished too quickly for gossip, and his absence was accepted the way the village accepted the changing of seasons, inevitable and beyond their influence. But Thera remained. Her father made no mention of punishment in public. There were no stocks, no public penance, just silence. And in Gravenfeld, silence was the coldest sentence. She was kept indoors, no longer joined him at the chapel. Her walks to market ceased. The women of the village stopped asking for her help with stitching or herbs or anything at all. She became a shadow in her own home, her days divided only by the scraping of dishes and the lengthening of shadows across the floor. Each evening she prayed, not because she was told to, but because it was the only time no one asked anything of her. At night, she opened the drawer where she had hidden the ribbons Jonas once left. Scraps of colour, no more than inches in length. She kept them wrapped in cloth, tucked beside the psalter she no longer read. She didn't cry, not because there was nothing to cry over, but because she'd already shed every tear in silence the night he disappeared. Her father's voice remained stern but composed. He never raised it, never insulted her. But when he passed her in the hall, he no longer looked at her face. And yet, even in isolation, rumours managed to slip in through the cracks. A washerwoman whispered that she had seen Thera at her window, lips moving without sound. "She's still speaking to him," the woman said, "though he's gone." A mason claimed the red thread was cursed. He'd found it caught in his sleeve after patching the rectory steps. He dropped it into the fire, then blessed himself. The whispers grew, not because Thera spoke, but because she didn't. Women who'd once called her quiet now called her secretive. Men who'd once envied the priest's discipline now called it failure. And yet Father Henrik did nothing, not out of mercy, but because perhaps he feared what more attention would cost. In the garden, weeds grew where Thera once planted rosemary. She wasn't allowed to return to the loom. She wasn't allowed to write letters, but she began sewing again in secret. Scraps stitched into linen, small lines of colour folded into hems. It wasn't weaving, but it was something. It was her way of remembering, not him, but herself. Because even if the village no longer looked her in the eye, and her father no longer spoke her name, she would leave proof that she had lived, not just as the priest's daughter, but as Thera. Which brings us to this quiet thought. When a woman is sentenced for loving and yet continues to stitch, is that defiance or survival? Or both? By the time summer returned, Thera's absence from the chapel was no longer noticed. New girls now sang in the nave. New faces bowed in the aisles. Time moved on, as it always did. The village forgot what it never fully understood, but forgetting does not undo what was done. Thera remained in the rectory, unmarried, untouched, unnamed. Her father never expelled her, but he never allowed her back into his good graces. They shared the same roof but not the same air. Meals were taken separately, words exchanged only when absolutely necessary. When he was ill, she brought his broth. When she was sick, no one came, and yet she endured. She grew herbs behind the rectory wall, quiet things that needed tending but asked for little. Lavender, marjoram, mint for tea. She stitched, too, delicate threads coloured where she could get dye, pale where she could not. The cloth she made never left the house, but they filled it nonetheless. Small beauty in a place that had once declared her a shame. Jonas never returned. She didn't expect him to. Perhaps he was chaste. Perhaps he left for her sake. Or perhaps he simply fled, as those without power sometimes must. She never received a letter, never saw his face again. But she never burned what he gave her. The thread remained, wrapped in linen, pressed beneath a stone tile in the corner of her room. Not a shrine, not a secret, just a reminder that once she had been chosen, not by a father, not by duty, but by someone who saw her, not her station, not her silence, but her. And in that remembering, she reclaimed something. When her father died, his hand clenched around the rosary he clung to even in sleep. No one asked what she would do. She remained. She did not cry, she cleaned the chapel herself, tended the garden alone, took the prayers from the children who had no one else to guide them, and when asked if she would leave, start fresh somewhere new, perhaps marry, she only smiled and said, "My choice was already made, once." Years later, a girl came to her door. Young, uncertain, Sumimas had swirled about her and a farmhand too poor to name. Her father had struck her, her mother had wept. Thera took her in, gave her tea, did not ask for an explanation, and when the girl asked, "How did you bear it?" Thera reached for her needlework and replied, "They took everything from me except what I chose to carry." And that, more than punishment, more than shame, more than any priest's sermon, was power. They met in the alley behind the stables, not by design, but because that was where people like them usually ended up. Emery, the shoemaker's son, had come to deliver a pair of boots for the captain of the guard, freshly oiled and stitched to perfection. The page, Roland, had come to rub down the captain's horse, his silks tied up with string so they wouldn't drag in the hay. They were both 16, both tired, both unnoticed. Their first conversation was about horses. Roland hated them, too tall, too proud. Emery laughed and said he didn't trust anything with eyes bigger than a spoon. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They began to find reasons to meet again. Emery brought scraps of leather shaped into trinkets. Roland brought figs stolen from the manor kitchen. They traded stories. Emery spoke of his father's workshop, the smell of wax and old iron. Roland spoke of noblemen who spoke in riddles and didn't know how to lace their own belts. Neither of them mentioned how close they sat, or how long their fingers brushed when passing things back and forth. Until one morning, sunny, ordinary, nothing special, they reached for the same apple, and didn't let go. It was only a second, but that second passed under the gaze of the stablemaster's wife. She said nothing to them, but she said plenty to others, and within a day it was known. Not what had happened. There was no what, really. Just two boys, one from the trade lane and one from the manor path, holding hands behind the stables. It might have been dismissed, laughed off. But Roland wore lace at his collar, and Emery's father had debts to the same house Roland served. By sunset, Emery was told not to return to the manor again, and Roland was moved from the stables to the chapel. To keep him focused, the steward said. To keep him separate, others whispered. They hadn't even kissed, but in a place where power is fragile and class is sacred, affection alone could be called insolence. They wrote letters after that, not many, and never in full, just scraps, a piece of parchment tucked into a heel, a name etched faintly into a stirrup strap, a drawing of a sparrow scratched onto the side of a bucket, erased the next day. And once, just once, when Roland passed through the village square with his master's steed, he dropped a single shoelace near Emery's stall, brown leather, knotted carefully, and Emery, in front of 5 customers and his father, picked it up and held it without a word, which brings us to the thought that started it all. When 2 hands touch and no one is hurt, Why does everyone else panic? The shoelace stayed beneath Emery's pillow, not as a keepsake exactly, but as something solid. Something that proved the whole thing wasn't just imagined. That there had been a glance held too long, a palm pressed into another, a breath shared in secret. He didn't talk about it. Not to his father, not to the apprentices who teased him about the page boy, not to the customers who avoided his eyes when ordering boots now. But he kept stitching, kept polishing, kept waiting. Roland was harder to find. Once reassigned to the chapel, he no longer walked the village path. His chores were silent now, dusting icons, hauling water, washing robes. The knight he served had asked no questions, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps out of calculation. The household had decided to handle things internally. That meant no scandal, no stocks, no punishment that could be seen. Just reassignment. The quiet exile practiced by the privileged. But Roland knew what was being said. That he'd been led astray. That the shoemaker's son was too familiar, too bold. That the village lanes could poison even a page's heart. And Emery? He heard just as much. That he had dared reach too high. That he'd embarrassed his father. That one misstep, one gesture had marked him. The shop lost 3 clients the following week. A woman who'd once called him clever now whispered behind her hand. Even the children, unknowing, repeated what their parents said at table. And still, he stitched. Because there was work, because work didn't judge. But when the steward's apprentice came to collect a repair order and left behind a coin wrapped in red thread, Roland's colour, Emery's hand stopped. Just for a moment. He unwrapped it, later, alone. Inside no letter. Just a line scratched into the paper. Not everything they take can be taken. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Enough to steady him, enough to keep him from breaking. And that night, he tied the shoelace into a loop, hung it from the peg beside his cot, a talisman, not of defiance, but of memory. And when his father asked him, softly, "Will this pass?" Emery replied, "Maybe, but it won't be forgotten." Which brings us closer to the edge of this quiet ache. When affection is mistaken for offence, what happens to the 2 hearts that never meant to make noise? The season changed, as they always do. Summer folded into the softer winds of autumn. And with it, the village forgot what it once whispered. New rumours bloomed. A merchant's barn caught fire. A cow was born with 2 white spots in the shape of a cross. People moved on as they must. But some things, quiet things, don't leave so easily. Emery continued at the shop. His father never brought it up again. But something in his tone grew gentler. He no longer snapped when orders were late. He let Emery close early on Sundays. And when a young man with noble crests on his cloak asked for a fitting, Emery's father took the measure himself. That too was a kind of protection. The shoelace remained on its peg, a loop of brown leather, weathering with time, not a shrine, not a statement, just a reminder. At the manor, Roland worked mostly in the chapel now. His role became less about serving the night, more about keeping himself out of the halls. He took to reading quietly, humbly, transcribing simple psalms into spare parchment. The steward said this was to keep him useful. The other pages said little. One offered him bread unasked. That was the only kindness. Still, no one dared ask him what had happened behind the stables. They didn't need to. It was written in the way he bowed his head slightly lower now, and the way he tied his sleeves a little tighter at the wrists, and the way he kept a small square of leather folded into the pages of his psalter. They never spoke again. Not with words. They passed each other only once more, on the far edge of the square, during the candle market just before Lent. Emery was carrying a tray of souls. Roland walking with the steward. Their eyes met. Briefly. No nod, no greeting. Just the smallest curve of recognition. And that was enough. Years later, when the shoemaker's son became the shoemaker himself, he kept a drawer in the back of his workshop filled with scraps he never used. Brown leather, carefully shaped. Some with small knots tied in them, others pressed flat. And when a boy once asked why he kept them, Emery said, "Because someone once gave me something that wasn't meant to last, but it did." As for Roland, no one knows where he ended up. Some said he took vows. Others said he travelled east, into a court where titles mattered more than truth. But those who remembered him said this: he never raised his voice. He wrote with a steady hand, and in every copy of the Psalms he ever transcribed, there was always one small mark in the corner of Psalm 83. Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity. Which leads us to the quiet close of this tale. When a bond is broken not by choice but by the world around it, can it still leave something whole behind? Her name was Maëlle, and she had the kind of laugh that couldn't stay inside her mouth. It startled hens, turned heads at market, and echoed off the stone walls of the village square. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't rude. She simply found joy where others had forgotten to look, in the shape of clouds, the crooked walk of the butcher's dog, the noise geese made when startled. But in a village like Caudebec, joy was not something a girl was expected to carry so loudly, especially not in the company of a boy like Bastien. Bastien worked with the charcoal burners on the edge of the woods. He wore soot like a second skin. His fingers were always black, his boots always torn. No one quite knew who his father was, and though he kept to himself, he watched Maëlle the way people watch sunlight. When they've lived too long under rain, they weren't courting, not officially, but they walked the same road more often than chance would allow. They stood a little too close when they spoke. They shared bread behind the old granary, and once, on the Feast of St. Giles, she laughed so loudly at something he whispered that even the priest turned his head. That moment, that single bright sound, was what changed everything. The following day, her mother didn't speak to her during supper. The priest called her to confession without explanation, and the village women began to look at her as if her skirts had shortened overnight. She hadn't sinned, but she'd laughed. With him. And in a place where daughters were taught to lower their voices and their eyes, that was loud enough to be dangerous. Bastien didn't stop walking the road, but Maëlle was sent away from it. Not far, just across the river to her aunt's. "Until you calm," her mother said. No charges, no shame pronounced aloud, just distance. And that was worse because it pretended not to be punishment. But it was. The road to her aunt's house was lined with birch trees and silence. The laughter didn't come as easily there. And the worst part? No one ever asked what he had said. The thing that had made her laugh. So full, so sudden, so true. It was just this. You look like you belong in a painting, but they'll only let you be the frame. Which leads us gently into the hush between laughter and exile. When a girl is punished not for sin, but for joy, what kind of world does that reveal? Her aunt's house sat quiet beneath the slope of a wooded hill, wrapped in ivy and the faint smell of drying herbs. Maëlle was given the smallest room, the one with slanted ceilings and a window that looked nowhere in particular. It was not unkind, but it was not home. Her aunt was not cruel, but she did not laugh. She salted everything with caution and served every meal with the phrase, "You'll understand in time." The weeks stretched, slow and clean. No one called for her, no one came to visit. The road she had once walked with Bastien was now nothing more than a line in memory. He hadn't sent word. She hadn't expected him to. What could he say? What could he do? He had no power to bring her back, and no place to follow her to. She helped with the garden, fed the hens, learned to cook without clatter. She kept her voice low and her laughter lower. It wasn't that she'd grown ashamed, but sound, once punished, finds its own quiet. Still at night she hummed, soft wordless melodies that drifted through the rafters, the kind of sound too small to be called rebellion, but too alive to be called surrender. One day, in the market square of the new village, she overheard a traveller mention Caudebec. Her ears perked before her name could stop her. "There was some stir a while back," the woman said, arranging turnips. "A boy and the priest's goddaughter. Just laughter, they say, but that was enough." The man beside her scoffed. "That village punishes weather. Too much sun and they'll claim its pride." Maëlle smiled to herself. It was the first time she'd heard someone else name it. Not scandal, not disobedience, just laughter. That evening her aunt noticed the shift. "You've got your colour back," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Maybe," Maëlle answered, then added, "Maybe it never left." She didn't ask to return. She didn't beg forgiveness. She simply packed one morning, left a note on the hearth and crossed the river by foot. No one stopped her, and when she reached the edge of Caudebec, it was dusk. She walked the old road again, the same one that once held her joy. She didn't expect Bastien to be there, and he wasn't. But the granary still stood, and so did the memory, and that was enough, because now she knew something she hadn't known before. Her laugh was not a threat, it was a flame, and the world had tried to smother it not because it was wrong, but because it was bright, which brings us softly toward this reflection. When a girl's joy is called rebellion, what else might she be right about? She returned quietly. No one rang bells, no doors opened in greeting. The villagers of Caudebec watched from thresholds and windows, whispering behind ladles and market baskets. But they did not tell her to leave. They did not call the priest. They did not stop her from stepping back into the square where she had once laughed too freely. Maëlle walked with a woven basket on her hip, head high, eyes calm. She visited the baker first, not because she needed bread, but because he had once looked away from her in the square. He blinked when she entered, as if uncertain whether she was real. She placed 2 coins on the counter and said, "Something with cinnamon, if you have it." He nodded, wordless, and wrapped a small bun with trembling fingers. That was how it began. The seamstress took her measurements again, muttering only that skirts had changed slightly. The apothecary offered her dried chamomile without charge. And eventually the whispers softened, not because they had changed their minds, but because they had moved on to someone else. But Bastien had not. He still lived near the charcoal pits, still smelled of the smoke and damp moss. When she first passed him on the road again, weeks after her return, they didn't speak. He looked surprised, almost guilty. She gave him a nod, no more, but the second time she stopped and said, "What was it you said, that I'd be the frame?" He blinked. "That they'd let you be the frame, not the painting." She smiled. "I've decided I'm both." He didn't reach for her hand, and she didn't offer it. But they walked the rest of the path together. Quiet. Equal. They never married. People assumed they would, but they didn't. They remained close. Shared harvests, shared tools, shared evenings under the same sky, sometimes with words, sometimes without. But Maëlle did not return to the shape others had once carved for her. She laughed again, not often, but truly. She joined the midwives, tended gardens, read to the children who hated psalms, and when asked years later what it was like to be exiled for something as small as laughter, she would say, "It was never small. That's why they feared it." And in her home, modest, sunlit, warm, there hung no portraits, only a single ribbon, faded from time, that once tied a market basket. And every time she caught sight of it, she smiled, not because it held the past, but because it reminded her she had outlived it. Her name was Odette, and when she sang, the chapel changed. The light through the stained glass seemed warmer, the air quieter, even the birds near the windows paused. She sang not with force, but with clarity, her voice thread-like and strong, like silk drawn taut. She had joined the choir at 12, chosen not for birthright, but for pitch. By 17, she was the one they leaned toward, when the notes wavered. She knew every psalm by heart, but not all of them were meant for prayer. There was one boy, Jules, a scribe's apprentice who inked the choir books and sharpened the abbess's pens. He was a careful boy, hands always smudged with blue, and his voice never quite matched the rest of him, soft, uncertain. He sat in the back during practices, humming quietly as he repaired the fraying edges of ancient hymnals. They spoke only in passing, brief nods, a quiet thank you when she fetched a sheet. But one day she found a folded piece of parchment tucked into the margin of her psalter. Just above the line of Laudate Dominum, it read, "When you sing, it feels like the world is holding its breath." She said nothing, but she kept the note. 3 days later, she slipped her reply into the hymnal on the stand he always sat beside. "Then I shall keep singing." They didn't touch. They didn't meet in corners. Their entire courtship lived between pages and staves written in the ink meant for holy use. He gave her verses, Latin turned gently sideways, sometimes from psalms, sometimes his own. She returned drawings, small ones, never seen by others. A candle, a dove, a quill with wings. Until one day the abbess found it. Not a letter, not a sketch, just a psalter with a page that had been folded too carefully. She opened it, and read the line, and said nothing, for now. But the next practice Jules did not appear. Odette asked once. She was told he had been reassigned. When she asked where, the abbess only replied, "Far enough." And the next morning she was told she would no longer sing. No explanation, no accusation, just silence. Her place in the choir was gone, her psalter removed, her name never spoken during rehearsal. She had not sinned in body, but she had let affection enter the margins of sacred music, and that was enough. She tried to return, to explain, but in a world where even words must be weighed like relics, there is no room for love that's scribbled between the lines. Which leads us to this final reflection of this opening. When all you've shared are words, why do they carry more punishment than touch? The chapel had never sounded quieter. Without Odette's voice, the choir lost its centre. The harmonies faltered, the altos drifted sharp. The abbess, though firm in her silence, cleared her throat more often than usual, and the congregation noticed. They always do, not in words perhaps, but in the way their heads no longer tilted toward the nave as they once had. Something was missing. Odette was still allowed to attend service. She stood at the back now, behind the pillar nearest the exit, where she could see the altar but not be seen by those who sang in her place. Her robes remained the same, her presence unchanged, but her voice, once invited, once celebrated, was now locked behind her teeth. She did not weep, she did not beg, but she no longer hummed as she walked, and her hands, once used to holding music sheets with ease, now curled tightly into the fabric of her sleeves. Jules never returned. There was no letter, no word, only the absence. But sometimes she swore she saw his handwriting in the margins of the new psalters, just a flick of ink on a stave, a capital letter looped in a way only he did. She imagined him in a colder chapel somewhere far from their own, still copying, still careful, still missing me. She began to sing again, softly, alone. At night, when the candles burned low and no one remained in the chapel but the shadows and pews, she sang to the rafters, to the stone, to the silence that had replaced her place in the choir, and when the hymns reached the high notes, she sang them without hesitation, because even if no one gave her permission, the songs still remembered how she sounded. One morning, tucked into the bottom of the offering bowl, she found a slip of paper folded 6 times. Her name wasn't written, but she knew. It read, "I still follow the echo." No signature, no seal, just a single pressed flower, dried lavender, wrapped inside. She said nothing, just placed it between the pages of her old hymnal, which she had retrieved from the dustroom weeks ago, despite being told to leave it. They never spoke again, but every time the choir sang a note she had once carried, she knew the difference, and so did they, which leads us to ask, softly, humbly, when a voice is banished from the choir but still sings in the soul of the stone, has it ever truly left? Years passed, and with them came new voices, clear, eager, young. The choir filled again, the harmonies steadied, but still, there were songs that never rose quite the same. Older sisters whispered that something had shifted in the tone of the chapel, though no one could name it. The abbess never spoke of Odette again. Her name was omitted from choir ledgers, her attendance unremarked upon. She remained among the silent, but not as a penitent. She had simply been made invisible. But Odette did not vanish. She sang still, but now it was the garden that held her voice and the laundry lines, and the narrow stone corridor where wind whispered through window slats. When asked to join in service, she obeyed in silence. When asked to copy prayers, she wrote with steadiness. But she never sang for others again, not by request. Her voice had become hers, only hers. There were still traces of Jules here and there. New books arrived from distant scriptoria, and once, when cataloguing them, she found a line from a hymn with an asterisk inked faintly beside it. It was a small, quiet mark, but it followed a phrase she once sang solo, "Benedicite omnia opia Domini," "Bless all your works, O Lord." She folded that page closed and pressed it to her heart, just once, and then placed the book on the shelf, careful not to disturb the others. When the abbess died, a younger, kinder woman took her place. She noticed Odette's name in an old roll of psalmists and asked quietly, "Why don't you sing any more?" Odette only smiled. "Because I already did." The new abbess didn't press her, but she left a single candle lit on the practice stand every evening after supper, just in case. Odette never returned to the choir, but she did begin teaching younger girls to breathe through their bellies, to hold their tones in the centre of their mouths, to shape vowels as though they were cradling something sacred, and she taught them how to sing without asking permission, not loudly, but fully. Sometimes one of them would ask why she never stood with them during Vespers. She'd say, "Once I did, and it was enough." She died many years later, in her bed near the window, as the evening bells rang. The girl who found her said she looked as if she had just finished a note and was listening for the echo, and when they opened the hymnal she had kept by her bedside all that time, pressed between Psalm 92 and 93, was the lavender still intact, and a note, faded but legible, that read, "Let them forget my name, but let them remember I sang." And so the last whispers of those long-forgotten lovers fade into the mist of time. The chapel they once met in is silent now. The alleyway they once walked remains unchanged, stone upon worn stone. But somewhere, in the hush of twilight, their presence lingers. As the images and voices of the past slip into silence, what remains is the quiet resilience of the human heart. Even when judged, even when shamed, love found a way to breathe. Hidden, tender, and real. And now, there are no more stories to follow tonight. Only the hush of history and your own peaceful breath. Let the world fade away. May you find calm, and may your dreams be gentle and deep.